Welcome, dear traveller, to this quiet corner of the night where stories unfold like mist across the Thames, where mysteries whisper themselves into being, and wear the themselves into being, and where the soft glow of gaslight beckons you toward rest. Tonight, we journey together into the fog-shrouded streets of Victorian London, where the greatest detective who ever lived faces a mystery unlike any he has encountered before. This story is crafted for those moments when your mind needs somewhere gentle to wander, when the day's troubles must dissolve into the peaceful unknown of sleep. So, settle deeply into your pillows now. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Feel the weight of your body sinking into comfort, and allow yourself to simply listen as we step through time itself, back to an autumn evening in 1893, when the rain fell soft as secrets upon the cobblestones of Baker Street. The fire crackles low in the hearth of 221B Baker Street, its amber light dancing across walls lined with leather-bound volumes and curious artifacts collected from 100 solved mysteries. Outside, London wraps itself in a velvet cloak of October rain, each droplet whispering against the window panes in that ancient, soothing rhythm that has lulled countless souls to sleep across the centuries. The streets below glisten like dark mirrors beneath the gas lamps, reflecting pools of warm golden light that shimmer and blur in the persistent drizzle. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolls 9 times, its deep resonance absorbed almost immediately by the thick, embracing fog that has crept up from the river, winding through alleyways and courtyards, like something alive and dreaming. Within this sanctuary of warmth and learning, Sherlock Holmes sits in his favoured chair, the one worn smooth by years of contemplation, positioned at precisely the angle that allows him to observe both the fireplace and the rain-streaked windows simultaneously. He holds a violin, though he does not play it now, merely cradles it against his shoulder, as one might hold something precious and familiar. His long fingers rest upon the strings without pressure, and his grey eyes, those remarkable eyes that can pierce through deception as easily as light through water, gaze into the flames with an expression of deep, meditative quietness. He wears his purple dressing gown, the one Mrs. Hudson insists makes him look like some Gothic nobleman, and his dark hair falls slightly across his forehead, in a way that suggests he has been motionless for quite some time. Across from him, in the companion chair of slightly lesser wear, Dr. John Watson sits with a medical journal open upon his lap, though his attention has drifted from its pages to the peaceful scene before him. The good doctor has removed his jacket and loosened his collar, for the room is wonderfully warm, heated by both the excellent fire and the peculiar coziness that Baker Street always seems to possess on rainy autumn evenings. His kind face, weathered by his military service in Afghanistan, yet softened by his gentle nature, reflects the firelight as he watches his friend in companionable silence. Between them, upon a small table of dark mahogany, sits the tea service, blue and white china that Mrs. Hudson brings up every evening at 8 o'clock precisely, along with a plate of her excellent biscuits that neither man has yet touched. Holmes shifts slightly in his chair, a small movement that nonetheless breaks the stillness like a pebble dropped into a pool. He lifts the violin from his shoulder and sets it carefully in its case, which rests open beside his chair. The gesture is slow, deliberate, performed with the same focused attention he brings to examining evidence at a crime scene. When the instrument is safely nestled in its velvet-lined case, He reaches for the teacup on the table between them, wrapping his long fingers around it, as though drawing not just warmth from the porcelain, but something more essential. Comfort, perhaps, or simply a momentary anchor to the peaceful present. Do you know what I find most fascinating about fog, Watson? Holmes asks suddenly, his voice low and contemplative, barely louder than the rain itself. He does not look at his friend when he speaks, but continues to gaze into the fire as though the flames might hold answers to questions not yet formed. Watson closes his journal, marking his place with a finger, before setting it aside entirely. I confess, I have never given it much thought, Holmes. It is merely weather, is it not? Water, vapour, condensed in the lower atmosphere. Scientifically, yes, Holmes agrees, taking a slow sip of his tea. But consider its effect upon the human mind, upon perception itself. In fog, distances become meaningless. A man 10 feet away might be invisible while sounds from a quarter-mile distant seem to occur just beside your ear. It distorts reality, creates uncertainty, transforms the familiar into the mysterious. He pauses, and the firelight catches the side of his face, illuminating the sharp angle of his cheekbone, the thoughtful set of his jaw. It is the perfect condition for secrets to thrive, for the hidden to remain hidden, for the extraordinary to masquerade as the ordinary. Before Watson can respond to this somewhat ominous observation, a sound breaks the peaceful spell of the evening. The sharp, insistent ring of the doorbell below. Both men glance toward the door of their sitting room, then at each other. Visitors at this hour are unusual, though not unprecedented. Holmes's reputation draws desperate souls at all hours, though most have the courtesy to call during daylight. They hear Mrs. Hudson's footsteps in the hall below, the opening of the front door, and then a moment of muffled conversation. The voice of the visitor is male, educated, but there is something strained in its tone, even through the barrier of floors and walls. Watson finds himself sitting up straighter, his soldier's instincts awakening, despite the comfortable drowsiness the warm room had induced. Holmes, by contrast, seems to relax further into his chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth, the smile of a man who welcomes any interruption to tedium, any puzzle to engage his restless intellect. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she says, her Scottish accent more pronounced than usual, as it always becomes when she is disturbed. "There is a gentleman here to see you, a Professor Blackwood from the British Museum. He says it is most urgent, and—" She hesitates, glancing back toward the stairs. "He seems quite distressed, sir. Quite distressed indeed." Holmes rises from his chair with fluid grace, setting his teacup aside and tightening the belt of his dressing gown. "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson, and perhaps prepare a fresh pot of tea. Something strong and restorative, I think." As their landlady descends to fetch their visitor, Holmes moves to the mantelpiece, his fingers drumming lightly against the wood. In that way, Watson has learned, indicates keen anticipation. A professor from the British Museum, Watson. How intriguing. What could drive a man of learning and presumably sound temperament out into such weather at such an hour? The footsteps returning up the stairs are heavier now, accompanied by Mrs. Hudson's lighter tread. When the door opens, the man who enters is indeed a figure of some distress. Professor Cornelius Blackwood is perhaps 50 years of age, tall and spare, with iron-grey hair and a neatly trimmed beard. He wears an expensive overcoat that streams with rain, and his hands tremble slightly as he removes his hat. His eyes, magnified behind wire-rimmed spectacles, dart about the room with an expression that mingles fear with desperate hope. "Mr. Holmes," he says, his voice hoarse, as though he has been shouting or perhaps weeping. "Dr. Watson, thank God you are at home. I apologize for the intrusion at this hour, but I am at my wits' end. Something impossible has happened, something that defies all rational explanation, and yet I have seen it with my own eyes." Holmes gestures towards the chair he himself has vacated. "Please, Professor, sit by the fire. You are chilled through. Mrs. Hudson will bring tea momentarily. Take a moment to collect yourself, and then tell us everything." Blackwood sinks into the chair as though his legs can no longer support him. He does not remove his wet coat, but merely sits, staring into the fire, his hands clasped tightly together to still their trembling. Watson, his medical instincts engaged, moves closer, observing the man's pale complexion, the shadows beneath his eyes, the way his breathing comes quick and shallow. "When did you last eat, Professor?" Watson asks gently. Blackwood looks up at him, seeming to truly see him for the first time. I cannot remember. Yesterday, perhaps. The day before. Time has become strange, Doctor. Ever since I found the manuscript, time has become very strange indeed." Holmes, who has been standing by the window, gazing out at the fog-shrouded street, turns sharply at these words. "A manuscript, you say? From the museum's collection?" "Not from our collection, Mr. Holmes. That is part of what makes this so extraordinary and so terrifying." Blackwood runs a shaking hand through his hair, dislodging droplets of rain that glisten in the firelight. 3 days ago, I received an anonymous parcel at the museum. No return address, no indication of the sender. Inside was a medieval manuscript, beautifully illuminated, written in what appears to be a mixture of Latin and medieval German. It purports to be a chronicle written by a Franciscan monk in the year 1462, detailing events that occurred in a remote monastery in the Carpathian Mountains. Watson pours a measure of brandy from the decanter on the side table and presses it into Blackwood's hands. The professor accepts it gratefully, taking a small sip before continuing. "The manuscript tells a story, gentlemen, a terrible story of a monastery besieged not by human enemies, but by something else entirely. The monk describes creatures that came in the night, beings that appeared human, but possessed impossible strength and an insatiable hunger for blood. He calls them Nosferatu, an ancient word whose origins are obscure, but whose meaning he makes terrifyingly clear. Before you fall asleep tonight, write in the comments what time it is for you and where you are from. I find it fascinating how stories travel across time and distance to find their listeners. But forgive me, I digress. The manuscript describes how these creatures infiltrated the monastery, how they turned brother against brother, until only the chronicler remained alive to tell the tale. The wind picks up outside, causing the windows to rattle softly in their frames. Holmes moves to stand behind Blackwood's chair, his hand resting thoughtfully against his chin. "A medieval horror story, Professor. Distressing, certainly, but hardly unprecedented. The Middle Ages produced countless such tales. Demons, vampires, werewolves, superstition given form in illuminated manuscripts. What makes this particular document so troubling that you brave a rain-soaked evening to consult me?" Blackwood sets down the brandy glass with trembling hands and reaches into his inner coat pocket, withdrawing a folded piece of paper. He hands it to Holmes without speaking, and Watson moves closer to read over his friend's shoulder. The paper contains a message, written in a precise, old-fashioned hand. Professor Blackwood, you possess something that does not belong to you. The chronicle of Brother Sebastian was never meant for mortal eyes in this age. Return it to the crypt beneath St. Dunstan's in the east by midnight on All Hallows Eve, or share the good brother's fate. We are watching. We are always watching. We are patient. We are eternal. The Nosferatu endure. The room seems to grow colder as Holmes reads the message aloud, his voice steady, but carrying an undercurrent of intense interest. Outside, the fog presses against the windows, like something trying to peer in, and somewhere in the distance, a dog begins to howl, a lonely, mournful sound that seems to speak of ancient fears and older darkness. Holmes folds the paper carefully and turns to face their visitor fully, his grey eyes now sharp with the hunter's intensity that Watson knows so well. When did you receive this warning, Professor? It was slipped under my office door yesterday morning. No one saw who delivered it. Blackwood's voice drops to barely above a whisper. But Mr. Holmes, that is not the worst of it. Last night, as I worked late in my study, translating the manuscript, I heard something at my window. I am on the 3rd floor, mind you. There is no balcony, no ledge wide enough for a man to stand upon. And yet, I heard it clearly, a soft tapping, like fingers against glass. When I looked up, he pauses, his face growing even paler. When I looked up, I saw a face pressed against the window. A man's face, deathly white, with eyes that reflected the lamplight like an animal's eyes. And he was smiling, Mr. Holmes, smiling with teeth far too long and far too sharp. The fire crackles loudly, sending up a shower of sparks, and in the sudden flare of light, the 3 men seem frozen in a tableau. The terrified professor, the concerned physician, and the detective, whose expression reveals nothing but whose mind, Watson knows, is already racing through possibilities, constructing theories, mapping out the investigation that must inevitably follow. The silence that follows Professor Blackwood's revelation stretches like a held breath, broken only by the steady whisper of rain and the gentle settling of coals in the fireball. Gentle settling of coals in the fireplace. Holmes remains perfectly still, his keen eyes fixed upon their visitor's face, with an intensity that seems to illuminate every shadow of fear, every tremor of genuine terror that plays across the professor's features. Watson finds himself instinctively checking the position of his service revolver, safely locked in the drawer of his writing desk, though what good a bullet might do against the creature Blackwood describes, he cannot say. The very air in the room feels changed somehow, as though the telling of the tale has invited something of the darkness outside to seep through the walls and take up residence in the corners where firelight cannot quite reach. Holmes moves with deliberate slowness, crossing to the window and drawing back the heavy curtain to peer out into the fog-shrouded street below. The gas lamps create islands of amber illumination in the thick mist, and beyond their glow, the world dissolves into gradations of grey and deeper grey, a watercolour painting left out in the rain. He stands there for a long moment, one hand resting against the window frame, his sharp profile outlined by the reflected firelight. When he speaks, his voice carries that particular quality Watson has learned to recognize, the tone of a man who has already begun to separate emotion from evidence, fear from fact, superstition from observable truth. "Tell me, Professor," Holmes says, without turning from the window. "This face you saw, describe it to me again, but this time focus not on your interpretation of what you witnessed, but on the specific details, the colour of the eyes, the texture of the skin, any distinguishing features you can recall." Blackwood draws a shuddering breath and closes his eyes, as though forcing himself to revisit that terrible moment. The skin was extraordinarily pale, almost luminescent in the lamplight. Not the pallor of illness, but something else, like marble or porcelain. The eyes... He pauses, his hands gripping the arms of the chair. The eyes were dark, possibly brown, but they caught the light in a way that made them appear to glow, much as a cat's eyes do in lamplight. The face was gaunt, with high cheekbones and a sharp jaw. And the mouth was smiling, but it was not a human smile, Mr. Holmes. The lips were drawn back to reveal teeth that seemed far too prominent, too sharp, filed perhaps, or naturally pointed. I cannot say which. Holmes turns from the window, and Watson observes a slight smile playing at the corners of his friend's mouth. Not amusement, but rather the satisfaction of a man who has just confirmed a hypothesis. And the tapping you heard before seeing this face, was it rhythmic or random, insistent or tentative? Rhythmic, Blackwood says immediately. 3 taps, then a pause, then 3 more, as though someone were signalling, or perhaps... He trails off, uncertainty clouding his features. Or perhaps attempting to unnerve you, Holmes finishes, which, I must observe, succeeded admirably. He moves to the chair opposite Blackwood and seats himself, steepling his fingers beneath his chin in that characteristic gesture Watson has seen 1,000 times before. "Now then, Professor, I must ask you a question that may seem insensitive, given your evident distress, but it is essential. Have you been sleeping well these past few days? Any unusual dreams? Periods of disorientation? Gaps in your memory?" Blackwood's brow furrows at this unexpected line of inquiry. No, Mr. Holmes. Or rather, I have not been sleeping much at all. The manuscript has consumed my attention, and I confess the story it tells has made me reluctant to close my eyes. But I am quite certain I was awake when I saw that face. I had been working for hours, translating by lamplight, and I was drinking coffee to keep myself alert. "Coffee," Holmes repeats thoughtfully. "Strong coffee, I presume?" "Very strong. I brewed it myself in my study." Mrs. Hudson enters at that moment, bearing a fresh tea tray, which she sets upon the table with a gentle clink of china against wood. The sound is somehow reassuring, a return to the ordinary and domestic in the midst of this extraordinary tale. She pours tea for each of them with practiced efficiency, adding sugar to Watson's cup without asking. She has served them long enough to know their preferences by heart. The steam rises from the cups in delicate spirals, carrying with it the comforting aroma of bergamot and black tea, and for a moment the room feels safe again, anchored in the rituals of civilized English life. "Thank you, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes says warmly. "That will be all for now. Please ensure all the doors and windows are secured before you retire. And Mrs. Hudson..." He waits until she turns back to face him. "If anyone should call this evening, anyone at all, you are to ring the bell twice before admitting them. Is that understood?" The landlady's eyes widen slightly, but she nods with the unflappable composure of a woman who has witnessed enough of Sherlock Holmes's cases to know when not to ask questions. As you say, Mr. Holmes. Good night, gentlemen. When the door closes behind her, Watson leans forward, his medical training asserting itself. Holmes, surely you do not believe there is any danger to Mrs. Hudson, or to us here in Baker Street? I believe in taking sensible precautions, Watson. Nothing more. Holmes accepts his teacup and takes a slow, measured sip, his eyes never leaving Blackwood's face. Professor, I should like to examine this manuscript of yours. Have you brought it with you? Blackwood shakes his head, a gesture that seems to carry both relief and regret. No, Mr. Holmes, I dared not remove it from the museum. It is far too valuable, and frankly, I feel safer having it under lock and key in my office than carrying it about London at night. But I did bring something else. He reaches into his coat again and withdraws a leather-bound notebook. I have been making detailed notes of the translation, along with sketches of the illuminations. The manuscript is written in a very specific hand, with unusual abbreviations and what appear to be coded passages. Some sections I have managed to decipher, while others remain frustratingly opaque. He opens the notebook and hands it to Holmes, who immediately becomes absorbed in its contents. Watson rises from his chair and moves to stand behind Holmes, looking over his shoulder at the pages. The handwriting is precise and scholarly, with annotations in Latin and English crowding the margins. But it is the sketches that catch Watson's attention, exquisitely detailed drawings, reproduced from the original manuscript. The first sketch shows a monastery perched on a mountainside, its stone walls rising stark against a sky filled with ominous clouds. The architecture is Romanesque, with thick walls and narrow windows that give it the appearance of a fortress as much as a house of worship. The next sketch depicts the interior of what must be the monastery's chapel, rows of simple wooden pews facing an altar, and behind the altar a massive crucifix that dominates the space. But there is something unsettling about the image, and it takes Watson a moment to identify what troubles him: the shadows. They fall at impossible angles, as though cast by a light source that moves contrary to all natural law. The third sketch makes Watson's breath catch in his throat. It shows a figure, or rather, the suggestion of a figure, standing in what appears to be a doorway. The artist has rendered it mostly in shadow, but certain details emerge with terrible clarity. Hands with elongated fingers, ending in what might be claws. A face that is more skull than flesh. And above all, eyes that seem to bore through the page itself with malevolent intelligence. Holmes's finger traces the lines of text beneath this final image. Brother Sebastian writes here of the night the creatures first appeared. He describes them as neither living nor dead, but something suspended between states of being, creatures that had surrendered their humanity for the promise of eternal existence. Fascinating phraseology for a medieval monk. He looks up at Blackwood, and you are certain this manuscript dates to 1462. The vellum has been tested, the ink composition, the binding materials, even the pigments used in the illuminations, all consistent with mid-15th century origin. Blackwood's voice carries the authority of a scholar on firm ground. I have examined hundreds of medieval manuscripts, Mr. Holmes. This one is genuine. A log in the fireplace shifts suddenly, sending up a shower of sparks and causing all three men to start slightly. The sound breaks the spell of concentration, and Watson finds himself becoming aware of how the room has grown darker as the evening advances toward midnight, how the shadows in the corners have deepened, how the fog outside presses more insistently against the windows. He moves to add another log to the fire, prodding the coals with the poker until flames lick hungrily at the new fuel, pushing back the darkness with renewed vigor. The manuscript may be genuine, Holmes says slowly, setting the notebook aside and picking up his teacup once more. But that does not necessarily authenticate the events it describes. Medieval chronicles are notoriously unreliable, filled with superstition, allegory, and apocalyptic imagery. Brother Sebastian may well have believed every word he wrote, but belief and objective truth are not always synonymous. I understand your skepticism, Mr. Holmes. I share it, or at least I did, until I received that warning and saw that face at my window. Blackwood leans forward, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. But there is more. After I received the note, I began to research St. Dunstan's in the East, the church mentioned in the warning. It is a very old church, parts of it dating to the 11th century, though it was largely rebuilt after the Great Fire. What I discovered. He pauses, seeming to gather courage. What I discovered is that the church has a crypt, sealed since and according to parish records from that time, the crypt was sealed specifically because of unholy disturbances and manifestations of evil that threatened the souls of the living. The rain has lessened somewhat, though the fog remains thick as ever. In the relative quiet, Watson becomes aware of other sounds. The ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece, the gentle hiss and pop of burning wood, the soft sound of his own breathing. Holmes sits motionless, his teacup forgotten in his hand, his brilliant mind clearly racing through implications, possibilities, connections that Watson can only guess at. All Hallows' Eve is tomorrow night, Holmes observes quietly. That gives us precious little time to unravel this mystery. Professor Blackwood, I will take your case, but I must insist on certain conditions. First, you will stay here tonight. Watson's old room stands empty, and I think it unwise for you to return to your lodgings alone. Second, tomorrow morning we shall visit the British Museum together, and I will examine both the manuscript and your office, particularly that third-floor window. Third, I should like to visit St. Dunstan's in the East and, if possible, gain access to this sealed crypt. Relief washes over Blackwood's features like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. Thank you, Mr. Holmes. Thank you. I confess I had not relished the thought of spending another night alone, jumping at every sound, imagining faces at every window. Watson rises and places a reassuring hand on the professor's shoulder. You are quite safe here, I assure you. Whatever the explanation for what you have experienced, natural or otherwise, it will not breach these walls. Now, let us get you settled. You look exhausted, and rest is the best medicine for shattered nerves. As Watson leads Blackwood from the room, Holmes remains seated, staring into the fire with an expression Watson cannot quite read. The detective's profile is sharp against the firelight, and there is something in his stillness that speaks of deep thought, of puzzle pieces being arranged and rearranged in that extraordinary mind. Just before Watson closes the door behind them, he hears Holmes speak softly, almost to himself. The Nosferatu endure, Holmes murmurs, repeating the phrase from the warning letter. An interesting choice of words. Not we exist, or we survive, but we endure. The language of creatures who have witnessed centuries pass, who measure time not in years, but in ages. He picks up Blackwood's notebook again, turning to the sketch of the shadowy figure. Or perhaps simply the language of men who wish us to believe such things. The door closes, leaving Holmes alone with his thoughts and the whispering fire and the patient, watching fogs that presses against the windows of Baker Street, waiting, as the message had said, with the patience of beings who have learned to measure forever in heartbeats and the falling of autumn rain. The journey from the British Museum to St. Dunstan's in the east carries Holmes and Watson through the heart of London, where the fog still lingers in patches, clinging to narrow alleyways and hovering above the Thames like reluctant spirits. They walk rather than take a cab, for Holmes insists that he thinks better, I hinks better in motion, and Watson finds himself grateful for the exercise after the close, book-scented air of Blackwood's office. The manuscript remains vivid in his mind, those illuminated pages with their precise rendering of terror, the angular script that seemed to writhe across the vellum like something alive. He shakes his head slightly, trying to dispel such fanciful thoughts, reminding himself that he is a man of science, a physician trained to seek rational explanations for all phenomena. Around them, London pulses with its usual morning energy. Street vendors call out their wares: fresh flowers, hot chestnuts, newspapers still damp from the press. A barrel organ plays somewhere nearby, its mechanical melody both cheerful and melancholy at once. They pass coffee houses where businessmen gather to discuss the day's prospects, bakeries releasing warm scents of fresh bread into the cool air, and shops displaying their goods in windows that reflect the grey sky in distorted fragments. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, Watson senses something else, a current of unease that may be only his imagination, but feels nonetheless real. Holmes walks with purpose, his long strides eating up the distance, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of their surroundings. He has said little since leaving the museum, clearly lost in the intricate workings of his own thoughts. Watson knows better than to interrupt such meditations, understanding that his friend's mind is cataloguing facts, testing theories, constructing and dismantling possibilities with the speed and precision of a master craftsman. They cross Fleet Street, weaving between carriages and carts, the sound of horses' hooves and iron-rimmed wheels, creating a symphony of urban life that Watson finds oddly comforting in its familiarity. "Tell me, Watson," Holmes says suddenly, breaking his silence as they turn down a quieter street lined with ancient buildings whose upper stories lean toward each other like old friends sharing secrets. "What is your assessment of Professor Blackwood's mental state? As a medical man, do you believe him to be suffering from any form of nervous disorder, any condition that might produce hallucinations or distortions of perception?" Watson considers the question carefully, calling to mind his observations of the professor. He exhibited genuine fear, certainly, and signs of sleep deprivation, the shadows beneath his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands. But his narrative was coherent, his memory of events clear and detailed. He did not display the confusion or disorientation I would expect from someone experiencing hallucinations brought on by exhaustion or illness. If I were to diagnose him, I would say he is a rational man who has experienced something that has profoundly shaken his sense of reality. Precisely my own conclusion, Holmes murmurs, nodding slowly, which leaves us with with two primary possibilities. Either he witnessed something genuinely anomalous that defies conventional explanation, or someone has gone to considerable trouble to create an elaborate illusion designed to terrify him specifically. The question, as always, is cui bono, who benefits from his fear? They emerge onto a street that runs parallel to the Thames, and here the fog grows thicker, rolling in from the river in slow grey waves. The smell of the water reaches them, not unpleasant, but earthy and ancient, carrying with it the essence of tides and the accumulated history of a river that has witnessed centuries of human endeavour. Watson pulls his coat tighter, feeling the dampness penetrate the fabric. Somewhere nearby, a church bell tolls the hour, its deep voice absorbed quickly by the fog, as though the sound itself struggles to travel through such thick air. Holmes pauses at a corner, consulting the small map he produced from his pocket earlier. St. Dunstan's in the east should be just ahead, down this lane. The church has a fascinating history, Watson. Originally built in the 11th century, largely destroyed in the Great Fire of 1666, rebuilt by Wren, damaged again by subsequent fires. A structure that has endured despite repeated attempts by flame and time to erase it. Rather appropriate, given the nature of our investigation. The lane he indicates is narrow and cobbled, flanked by buildings that predate the Great Fire, their timber frames dark with age, their overhanging upper stories blocking what little light penetrates the fog. As they walk down this passage, Watson feels as though they are stepping backward through time, leaving the modern world of 1893 behind and entering an older London, a medieval city that still exists in shadowed corners and forgotten lanes. Their footsteps echo off the close walls, and somewhere above he hears the flutter of wings as pigeons take flight from their roosts. The church appears before them quite suddenly, its tower rising through the fog like a pale finger pointing toward an invisible heaven. St. Dunstan's in the east is smaller than Watson expected, more intimate, with Gothic revival additions that blend seamlessly with the older Romanesque elements. The stonework shows its age, weathered by centuries of rain and wind, blackened in places by old smoke, softened at the edges by time's patient erosion. Ivy climbs portions of the walls, its leaves dark green against the pale stone, and the churchyard surrounding the building is overgrown, dotted with ancient grave markers that lean at drunken angles, their inscriptions worn smooth by weather. Holmes pushes open the iron gate that leads into the churchyard, and it releases a long, drawn-out creak that seems to announce their arrival to whatever presence might be waiting within. They walk along a path of broken flagstones, past graves dating back 200 years and more, past stone angels, whose faces have been reduced to smooth ovals by rain and time, past Celtic crosses and simple markers whose names have become illegible. The air here feels different, colder, heavier, as though the accumulated weight of centuries of prayer and mourning has given it substance. The church door stands slightly ajar, which strikes Watson as odd given the early hour. Holmes notices it too, for he exchanges a glance with Watson before placing his hand on the ancient wood and pushing the door open wider. The hinges protest with a sound that mingles with the creaking of old timber, and then they step inside, entering a space that seems to swallow sound and light with equal hunger. "Hello," Holmes calls out, his voice echoing in the vaulted space. "Is anyone here?" For a moment, silence answers him. Then, from somewhere toward the back of the church, comes the sound of a door closing softly, followed by footsteps approaching through an unseen passage. A figure emerges from the shadows beside the altar. A man of perhaps 60 years, dressed in clerical garb, with silver hair and a face lined by what might be wisdom or worry or both. He carries a candle, its small flame guttering slightly as he walks, casting moving shadows across his features. "Gentlemen," the clergyman says, his voice soft and cultured, marked by an accent that suggests education and breeding. "Welcome to St. Dunstan's in the East. I am Father Whitmore, the vicar here. I confess I was not expecting visitors at this hour, but you are most welcome nonetheless. May I ask, what brings you to our humble church?" Holmes steps forward, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. "Good morning, Father. My name is Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague, Dr. John Watson. We are investigating a matter that has led us to your church, specifically to inquire about the crypt beneath the building. I understand it has been sealed for some considerable time." Father Whitmore's expression changes subtly, the welcoming smile fading into something more guarded, more careful. He sets his candle on a nearby ledge and regards them with eyes that seem to assess and measure. "The crypt has indeed been sealed, Mr. Holmes, since the year 1751. May I ask what interest you have in it? It is not a subject I discuss readily, for reasons that I hope you will appreciate once you understand the history." A sudden gust of wind causes the candle flame to dance wildly, and somewhere in the church a door bangs shut with startling violence. All three men turn toward the sound, but nothing moves in the shadows. After a moment, Father Whitmore releases a breath Watson had not realized he was holding, and gestures toward the front pews. "Perhaps we should sit," the vicar says quietly. "What I have to tell you is not easily spoken while standing, and the church, as you can see, has its own ways of reminding us that we are not entirely alone here." They settle into a pew near the front, the old wood creaking beneath their weight. The stained glass windows cast coloured shadows across their faces. Holmes's sharp profile outlined in blue and gold, Watson's solid form bathed in red and green, Father Whitmore's silver hair seeming to glow with an inner light. The vicar folds his hands in his lap and begins to speak, his voice barely above a whisper, as though afraid of being overheard. "The crypt of St. Dunstan's in the East was sealed by order of the Bishop of London himself, following events that the Church has chosen neither to confirm nor deny publicly. The official record states only that unholy disturbances necessitated the sealing, but the truth, as recorded in documents I have been privileged to read as vicar of this church, is considerably more disturbing." He pauses, seeming to gather his courage. In the winter of 1751, several parishioners reported seeing figures in the churchyard at night. Figures that moved with unnatural grace, that seemed to glide rather than walk, whose eyes reflected lamplight like those of animals. These sightings coincided with a series of unexplained deaths in the parish. Young people, healthy and strong, were found dead in their beds with no mark upon them, save for 2 small wounds on the neck, as though they had been bitten by some venomous creature. Watson feels a chill that has nothing to do with the temperature of the church. Beside him, Holmes leans forward, his attention completely focused on the vicar's words. The then vicar, a man named Reverend Ashworth, investigated these deaths and came to believe that something was emerging from the crypt at night. He organized a vigil, 6 men armed with holy water and prayers. and they waited in the church one night for whatever might appear. According to Reverend Ashworth's account, which I have read in his own hand, something did indeed emerge from the crypt near midnight. He describes it as a man, or something that had once been a man, dressed in clothing of an earlier century, whose face was pale as death, and whose mouth opened to reveal teeth filed to points. The creature, and Reverend Ashworth uses that word specifically, attacked the vigil, displaying strength that seemed impossible for a human frame. 2 men died that night before the creature was driven back into the crypt. The entrance was sealed the following day with blessed mortar, and iron bars were placed across the door. The seal has never been broken since. The church falls silent except for the distant sound of the wind and the occasional settling of ancient timbers. Holmes sits perfectly still, his expression unreadable. Watson finds his hand moving unconsciously to rest on the pocket where he keeps his service revolver. Though what use bullets would be against the creature Father Whitmore describes, he cannot imagine. "And you believe this account?" Holmes asks finally, his voice neutral, betraying neither skepticism nor acceptance. Father Whitmore meets his gaze steadily. "I believe that Reverend Ashworth believed what he wrote. Whether the creature was truly what he thought it to be, a vampire, a Nosferatu, an undead thing, or whether it was something else, some human being afflicted with rare disease or driven to madness, I cannot say. But I do know that something is sealed in that crypt, Mr. Holmes, and I know that it should remain sealed." Holmes rises from the pew and walks toward the altar, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. He stands there for a long moment, gazing up at the crucifix, his hands clasped behind his back. When he speaks, his words seem addressed as much to himself as to his companions. "Father Whitmore, 3 days ago, Professor Cornelius Blackwood of the British Museum received an anonymous manuscript, a medieval chronicle detailing events remarkably similar to what you have just described, though occurring in the Carpathian Mountains in 1462, rather than London in 1751. Yesterday, he received a warning demanding that the manuscript be returned to the crypt of this very church by midnight on All Hallows' Eve, which is tomorrow night. And last night, he witnessed a face at his 3rd-floor window, a face with characteristics that match both the medieval chronicle's descriptions and Reverend Ashworth's account. Pale skin, reflective eyes, teeth like fangs. Holmes turns to face them, and in the coloured light from the stained glass, his expression appears almost otherworldly. "Now, I ask you, Father, what am I to make of such a convergence of seemingly impossible elements?" Before Father Whitmore can answer, a sound echoes through the church, the same sound Blackwood heard at his window, the sound that preceded the appearance of that terrible face. 3 taps, distinct and deliberate, followed by a pause, then 3 more taps. They come from somewhere below, from beneath the stone floor, from the sealed crypt, where something has waited in darkness for 142 years. The sound freezes them in place, 3 men transformed into statues by the rhythmic percussion rising from beneath ancient stone. Watson Fee beneath ancient stone. Watson feels his heart quicken despite himself, the soldier's instinct awakening, even as his rational mind searches for prosaic explanations, settling foundations, trapped air in old pipes, perhaps even rats moving behind walls. Yet the precision of those taps, their deliberate spacing, speaks of intelligence and intention, rather than accident or nature. The church seems to hold its breath around them, the very air growing still and heavy, waiting to see what will follow this subterranean announcement. Father Whitmore has gone pale, his weathered face draining of colour until he appears almost as spectral as the entities he has been describing. His hands grip the edge of the pew before him, knuckles white with tension, and his lips move silently in what might be prayer, or simply the repetition of protective words whose power lies more in comfort than efficacy. Holmes, by contrast, displays that peculiar intensity Watson has witnessed in moments of greatest danger, a sharpening of focus, a gathering of energy, as though every fibre of his being orients itself toward the source of the sound with the single-minded purpose of a compass needle seeking north. The crypt entrance, Holmes says, his voice cutting through the silence with startling clarity. Where is it, Father Whitmore? Show me now. The vicar rises unsteadily, reaching for his candle with trembling fingers. Mr. Holmes, I must counsel against. Show me, Holmes repeats, and there is steel beneath the courtesy, an implacable determination that brooks no argument. Father Whitmore nods reluctantly and leads them toward the rear of the church, past the altar with its cloth of white linen, past the ornate wooden screen that separates the sanctuary from the nave, through a narrow door that opens onto a stone staircase descending into darkness. The candle flame dances as they begin their descent, casting wild shadows that leap and stretch across walls of rough-hewn stone. The air grows noticeably colder with each step, carrying with it the smell of earth and something else, something Watson cannot quite identify. Not decay, precisely, but rather a scent of great age, of spaces long sealed from sun and air. The staircase ends in a small chamber, barely large enough for the three of them to stand together. The ceiling is low, forcing Holmes to duck his head slightly, and the walls press close on all sides. Directly ahead, set into the far wall, is a door of dark wood, reinforced with iron bands that have rusted with the passage of time. But it is not the age of the door that commands attention. It is the seal. Heavy chains wrap around the door's frame, fastened with locks whose keys have long since been lost or destroyed. Across the door itself, someone has painted symbols in what appears to be white paint, or perhaps chalk, though much faded now. Crosses and circles and other markings that Watson recognizes as protective signs from various traditions. A desperate layering of spiritual defenses. Holmes sets his candle on a small ledge and approaches the door, running his fingers along the chains, examining the locks, pressing his ear against the wood to listen. Watson joins him, revolver now openly in hand, though he feels slightly foolish holding it. What defense would bullets provide against something that has survived sealed in stone for over a century? Yet the weight of the weapon is comforting nonetheless, a tangible connection to the world of reason and physical law. The door is solid, Holmes murmurs, more to himself than to them. Oak, several inches thick, and the iron reinforcements appear sound despite the rust. The chains are modern, perhaps 50 years old, added presumably to strengthen the original seal. And yet, he falls silent, his ear still pressed to the wood, his eyes closed in concentration. And yet, Watson prompts quietly, and yet I hear nothing now. Whatever made that sound has ceased. Holmes straightens and turns to Father Whitmore, who has remained on the bottom step, as far from the sealed door as the small space allows. Father, I must ask you directly, do you have any means of opening this door? any record of where keys might be kept, any knowledge of how one might gain access to the crypt beyond. The vicar shakes his head emphatically. No, Mr. Holmes. The bishop's order was explicit. The crypt was to remain sealed in perpetuity. The keys to these locks were destroyed, thrown into the Thames according to the records. Even if I wished to open it, which I most certainly do not, I would have no means of doing so without breaking the chains, which would require tools I do not possess. Holmes nods slowly, his sharp eyes moving across every detail of the door and its seals, cataloguing, measuring, deducing. Tell me, has anyone attempted to access this crypt since it was sealed? Any unusual inquiries? Any suspicious visitors to the church? Not to my knowledge, Father Whitmore replies, though I have only been vicar here for 15 years. Previous vicars may have had different experiences, but if so, they left no record of them in the church archives. A sudden sound from above, the main church door opening, makes all three men start. Footsteps echo on the stone floor of the nave, slow and measured, accompanied by a rhythmic tapping that Watson realizes, after a moment, is the sound of a walking stick striking the floor. Father Whitmore calls up the stairs, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and curiosity. Hello, who comes to St. Dunstan's at this hour? The footsteps cease, and a voice responds. Male, elderly, cultured, with an accent Watson cannot quite place. Something vaguely European beneath the careful English pronunciation. I am a scholar, Father, seeking knowledge of this ancient place. I heard voices, and did not wish to intrude, but neither did I wish to leave without speaking with you. Might I have a moment of your time? Father Whitmore glances at Holmes, who nods slightly. The vicar ascends the stairs, and Watson makes to follow, but Holmes catches his arm, holding him back. They stand together in the dim chamber, alone before the sealed door, and Holmes's expression has transformed into something Watson recognizes with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. The look of a hunter who has just detected the scent of his quarry. Watson, Holmes breathes, barely audible. This is no coincidence. A mysterious scholar arriving precisely when we are examining the crypt? No, this is our adversary, whoever or whatever they may be, come to observe, to assess, perhaps to warn. Come, but let us approach carefully and observe before we reveal ourselves. They ascend the stairs as quietly as possible, emerging from the small door near the altar to find Father Whitmore speaking with a figure who stands in a shaft of coloured light from the stained glass windows. The visitor is tall, perhaps 6.5 feet, and thin to the point of gauntness, dressed in a black overcoat of old-fashioned cut, and carrying an ebony walking stick topped with silver. His face is concealed partially by the brim of a wide hat, but what Watson can see shows skin of remarkable pallor, and features that are aristocratic and sharp, high cheekbones, a thin nose, a mouth that seems too wide for the narrow face. The stranger appears to be in his 70s, though he stands erect and moves with a grace that suggests vitality despite his apparent age. When he turns slightly, catching sight of Holmes and Watson emerging from the shadows, Watson sees his eyes, dark, almost black, and they do indeed catch the light in a way that seems wrong somehow, reflecting it back with an amber gleam that reminds Watson uncomfortably of a cat's eyes seen in lamplight. Ah, the stranger says, and his voice carries a note of genuine pleasure, as though he has been hoping for this meeting. More visitors to this sacred place. How delightful. I am Count Orlok, recently arrived in London from my estates in the Carpathians. I have long been fascinated by the history of medieval churches, particularly those with unusual histories. His smile reveals teeth that are very white against his pale skin, and while they are not pointed or filed as Blackwood described, there is nonetheless something unsettling about that smile, something predatory beneath the veneer of scholarly courtesy. Holmes steps forward, removing his hat in a gesture of politeness that his eyes, sharp, assessing, missing nothing, transform into something more like a challenge accepted. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, at your service. And this is Dr. Watson. We share your interest in unusual histories, Count Orlok. In fact, we have recently been examining a most fascinating medieval manuscript, a chronicle written by a Franciscan monk in the Carpathians in 1462. Perhaps you have encountered similar documents in your own studies. The stranger's smile widens slightly, and for just a moment, Watson could swear those two white teeth appear longer, sharper. But then the Count laughs, a sound like dry leaves rustling, and the impression passes. The Carpathians are filled with old stories, Mr. Holmes. Monasteries where dark things occurred, legends of creatures that exist between life and death. But surely you, a man of reason and science, as your reputation suggests, place no credence in such superstitious tales. I place credence in evidence, Count Orlok, and I find it most interesting that you should appear here at this particular church on this particular morning when we are investigating a mystery that connects directly to the Carpathian region from which you claim to hail. Holmes takes a step closer, and Watson sees the Count's hand tighten almost imperceptibly on his walking stick. Tell me, do you know anything of a manuscript that has recently come into the possession of Professor Cornelius Blackwood at the British Museum? The church suddenly feels smaller, the air more oppressive. Father Whitmore stands to one side, his eyes moving between Holmes and the Count, like a man watching a chess match whose rules he does not fully understand, but whose stakes he senses are enormous. The coloured light from the windows shifts as clouds move across the sun outside, plunging them briefly into deeper shadow before emerging again into muted illumination. Count Orlok's smile never falters, but his eyes, those strange, reflective eyes, fix upon Holmes with an intensity that makes Watson's hand move instinctively toward his pocket and the revolver concealed there. I know nothing of this professor or his manuscript, Mr. Holmes. I am merely a traveller, a student of history, drawn to this place by its reputation. But I sense that I have intruded upon matters that do not concern me. Perhaps it would be best if I took my leave and continued my explorations elsewhere. He turns to go, his movements fluid despite his apparent age, but Holmes's voice stops him. One more question, if you would be so kind, Count. Where are you staying during your visit to London? I may have additional questions as my investigation proceeds, and I should like to know where I might find you. The Count pauses, his back still to them, and when he turns his head to look back over his shoulder, Watson sees something in that pale face that sends a chill down his spine. Not fear, not anger, but rather a kind of ancient amusement, as though Holmes has said something unexpectedly entertaining. I keep apartments in Whitechapel, Mr. Holmes, in Spitalfields, to be precise, though I confess I am rarely there during daylight hours. I am something of a night owl, you see. My constitution does not tolerate the sun well, but if you should wish to find me, I suspect that our paths will cross again quite naturally. London is a large city, yet somehow those who are meant to meet always do. He touches the brim of his hat in a gesture that might be farewell or mockery or both. "Until we meet again, gentlemen, Father Whitmore." And with that, Count Orlok walks toward the church door, his footsteps echoing, his walking stick tapping that same measured rhythm. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. The same rhythm Watson realizes with dawning horror as the tapping they heard from the sealed crypt moments before. The door closes behind him with a soft sound that seems nonetheless to reverberate through the church, like a judgment pronounced. And the three men are left standing in the coloured shadows, processing what has just occurred. Holmes stands perfectly still for a long moment, then slowly removes his gloves and tucks them into his pocket. When he speaks, his voice is low and thoughtful, carrying neither triumph nor concern, but rather the careful neutrality of a man who has just confirmed a dangerous hypothesis. "Gentlemen," he says quietly, "I believe we have just met the author of Professor Blackwood's warning, and if I am not mistaken, we have also just been issued a warning of our own. Subtle, civilized, but a warning nonetheless. The game, as they say, is most decidedly afoot." The afternoon finds Holmes pacing the length of the sitting room at Baker Street with the restless energy of a caged predator, his long Shah-caged predator, his long shadow stretching and contracting across the carpet as he moves back and forth before the windows where pale light struggles to penetrate the fog that has thickened rather than dispersed as the day progresses. Watson sits in his accustomed chair, Blackwood's notebook open upon his lap, studying the sketches and translations with growing unease. The encounter with Count Orlok has left them both disturbed in ways neither quite wishes to articulate, for to speak the fear aloud would be to give it substance, to acknowledge that they may be dealing with something that exists beyond the comfortable boundaries of rational explanation. Mrs. Hudson has brought tea at 3 o'clock, as is her custom, along with a plate of seed cake that remains untouched on the table between the two chairs. The fire burns low, needing attention, but neither man moves to tend it, each absorbed in his own contemplation of the morning's events. Outside, London goes about its business with muted sounds, the clip-clop of horses on wet cobblestones, the distant cry of a street vendor, the rumble of an omnibus passing, all of it filtered through the fog until it seems to come from another world entirely, a distant realm of normalcy that has somehow become separated from the shadowed reality they now inhabit. Holmes pauses at the window, his fingers drumming against the frame in that unconscious rhythm that signals intense mental activity. His reflection in the glass appears ghostly, insubstantial, as though he too is becoming something less than solid, drawn into the mystery's strange gravity. When he finally speaks, his voice carries the weight of conclusions reached through hours of silent deliberation. "The Count is our adversary, Watson. Of that I have no doubt. The tapping of his walking stick matching precisely the sound from the crypt, his arrival at the church at the exact moment we were investigating the sealed door, his knowledge of Carpathian legends, despite claiming ignorance of Blackwood's manuscript. These are not coincidences. They are messages, carefully calculated to inform us that he knows we are investigating, that he is aware of our every movement, and that he is confident enough in his position to reveal himself openly." Watson sets down the notebook and reaches for his now cool tea, taking a sip more for something to do with his hands than from any desire for refreshment. But what is his objective, Holmes? If he wishes the manuscript returned to the crypt, Why send such elaborate warnings? Why not simply steal it from Blackwood's office? The man, if he is indeed merely a man, displayed resources enough to appear at a third-story window and to know our whereabouts this morning. Surely theft would be a simpler course than this baroque campaign of terror. Ah, but terror is precisely the objective, my dear Watson. Holmes turns from the window, his grey eyes alight with the peculiar intensity that indicates he has grasped some essential thread of the pattern. Consider what has occurred from Blackwood's perspective. He receives an ancient manuscript filled with horrifying imagery and tales of supernatural predation. Then comes the warning, couched in language suggesting immortal beings who have endured across centuries. Then the face at the window, appearing impossibly at a height no normal man could reach. Each event builds upon the previous, creating a narrative of supernatural threat, conditioning Blackwood to believe he faces something beyond human agency. By the time tomorrow night arrives, All Hallows' Eve, when the veil between worlds is traditionally thought to thin, our professor will be primed to believe absolutely in the reality of the Nosferatu, prepared to do whatever is demanded to escape their attention. A log in the fireplace collapses suddenly, sending up a shower of sparks and breaking the spell of Holmes's monologue. Watson rises to tend the fire, adding fresh coal with the poker, stirring the embers to life. The burst of warmth and light is welcome, pushing back the encroaching shadows that seem to gather with unusual persistence in the corners of the room. When he returns to his chair, he finds Holmes has moved to stand by the mantelpiece, one hand resting on its edge, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames, as though they might reveal answers hidden in their ever-shifting patterns. But why? Watson presses. What could possibly be gained by frightening Blackwood into returning a manuscript to a sealed crypt? Is it valuable beyond its historical significance? Does it contain information someone wishes to suppress? Those are excellent questions, Watson, and I confess I do not yet have satisfactory answers to them. The manuscript itself appears genuine. Blackwood's expertise in such matters is considerable, and he found nothing to suggest forgery. Yet, its sudden appearance, delivered anonymously to a scholar who specializes in medieval religious texts, suggests it was sent with specific purpose. Someone wished Blackwood to read it, to become absorbed in its narrative, to be prepared for what would follow. Holmes pauses, and in the firelight, his face takes on a contemplative quality, almost dreaming. There is another possibility, of course, one that my rational mind resists, but which I cannot entirely dismiss. What if the Count is precisely what he appears to be? What if Count Orlok is indeed a creature of the type described in the manuscript, a Nosferatu who has survived across centuries by means we do not understand? What if the manuscript was sent not as part of an elaborate deception, but as a warning, a historical account meant to establish the reality of such beings before one of them revealed himself? Watson finds himself laughing despite the gravity of the situation, a nervous sound that dies quickly in the heavy air. Holmes, surely you cannot seriously entertain such a notion. Vampires, the undead, creatures that drink blood to sustain impossible longevity, these are products of folklore and superstition, not scientific reality. And yet, Holmes counters quietly, we live in an age of wonders, Watson. We have harnessed electricity, captured images in photographs, transmitted voices across great distances by wire. Each generation believes it has discovered the limits of the possible, only to have those limits expanded by new discoveries. Who is to say what might exist in the shadows beyond our current understanding? He straightens, shaking his head, as though to clear it of such speculation. But you are correct to call me back to empiricism. We must deal in observable facts, in evidence that can be tested and verified. To that end, I propose we pay a visit to Whitechapel this evening, to the address Count Orlok mentioned, Spitalfields. I should very much like to observe his living arrangements, to see what might be learned from the habitat of this mysterious foreign aristocrat. The thought of venturing into Whitechapel after dark sits uneasily with Watson, for that district carries its own dark associations. Only 5 years have passed since the Ripper murders transformed those streets into a byword for terror, and while those crimes have ceased, the shadow they cast remains. Yet he trusts Holmes's judgment, and if answers are to be found, they must be sought wherever the investigation leads. Very well, Watson says, rising to check his revolver, ensuring it is loaded and functioning properly. But we go armed, Holmes, and we remain together. I have no desire to be separated from you in those narrow alleys after nightfall. A knock at the door interrupts them, and Mrs. Hudson enters with a telegram on a silver tray. Holmes takes it, scanning its contents quickly, and his expression darkens. He hands the telegram to Watson without comment. The message is brief, sent from the British Museum. Holmes, come at once. Manuscript missing from safe. Office ransacked. Blackwood vanished. Inspector Lestrade investigating. Gregory. The room seems to tilt slightly, the comfortable refuge of Baker Street suddenly feeling less secure. Watson looks up from the telegram to find Holmes already reaching for his coat, his movements swift and purposeful. Whatever theories they have been constructing, whatever careful plans they have been formulating, events have accelerated beyond their control. The game has entered a new phase, more dangerous and more urgent than before. Come, Watson, Holmes says, his voice clipped and focused. We must reach the museum immediately. If Count Orlok has taken the manuscript and spirited away our client, then we are no longer investigating a case of intimidation and threat. We are now racing against time itself, for tomorrow night is All Hallows' Eve, and if the Count intends to return the manuscript to the crypt at midnight, as the warning specified, Blackwood's life may well depend on our ability to unravel this mystery before that deadline arrives. They descend the stairs rapidly, emerging onto Baker Street to find that the fog has grown so thick that visibility extends no more than a dozen feet in any direction. The gas lamps create spheres of hazy yellow light that seem to float suspended in the grey void, and the few pedestrians moving through the murk appear as phantoms, materializing suddenly and vanishing just as quickly. Holmes raises his arm to hail a cab, but the fog is so dense that several pass without seeing them, their drivers hunched over their reins, horses moving cautiously through the obscured streets. Finally, they secure a hansom, and Holmes gives the driver the address of the British Museum with instructions to make all haste. As the cab lurches into motion, Watson settles back against the seat, acutely aware of the revolver's weight in his pocket. Through the cab's windows, London slides past like a city seen in dreams, buildings appearing and disappearing in the fog, street corners emerging from nowhere, the occasional pedestrian's face floating past like a pale moon before vanishing again into grey oblivion. Holmes, Watson says quietly, what if we are already too late? If Blackwood has been taken, if the manuscript is gone, what leverage do we possess? How do we even begin to search for them in a city of this size? Particularly if we are dealing with someone who possesses the resources Count Orlok clearly commands? Holmes stares out to the window, his profile sharp against the fog-diffused light. When he answers, his voice carries a determination that Watson finds both reassuring and unsettling. We begin, Watson, by accepting that we may be facing an adversary unlike any we have encountered before. Whether Count Orlok is man or monster, mortal or immortal, he has demonstrated capabilities that suggest either extraordinary resources or... He trails off, leaving the alternative unspoken. The cab slows, navigating a particularly dense patch of fog, and in the enforced silence, Watson becomes aware of sounds that seem to come from all directions at once. Footsteps that might be echoes, or might be someone following. The distant howl of a dog that sounds almost like a human cry. And once, just for a moment, what sounds like the same rhythmic tapping they heard in the church. Though when he strains to listen more carefully, he hears nothing but the horse's hooves and the rattle of the cab's wheels on cobblestones. "We are being watched," Holmes murmurs, so quietly Watson almost misses it. "I have felt it since we left Baker Street. Someone, or something, is tracking our movements through this fog." Watson resists the urge to look around, keeping his gaze fixed forward, even as his hand moves to rest on the pocket containing his revolver. The fog presses against the cab windows like something alive, something curious, and London has transformed into a place he no longer recognizes. A city where ancient things might walk unseen, and where the boundaries between the rational and the impossible have grown dangerously thin. The British Museum materializes before them like a temple emerging from clouds, its columns pale against the grey darkness. As they dismount from the cab and approach the building, Watson sees that lights burn in upper windows. Blackwood's office, he realizes, where even now Lestrade and his men must be searching for clues to explain the professor's disappearance and the manuscript's theft. But as they climb the steps toward the entrance, Holmes stops suddenly, his head tilted as though listening to something only he can hear. "Watson," he says softly, gripping his friend's arm, "I believe we have been led here deliberately. This discovery, this summons, it feels orchestrated, as though Count Orlok wishes us to find the office ransacked and Blackwood missing. But why? What purpose does it serve to reveal his hand so openly?" Before Watson can respond, the museum door opens and Inspector Lestrade appears, his usually confident face marked by confusion and something approaching fear. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank God you've come. You need to see this. I don't know what it is, but it's like nothing I've encountered in 20 years with the Yard." They follow him inside, through corridors now familiar from their morning visit, up the stairs to the third floor where Blackwood's office door stands open, spilling light into the darkened hallway. And as they step across that threshold, Watson sees immediately what has disturbed Lestrade so profoundly. The office is indeed ransacked, but not in any ordinary fashion. Books lie scattered across the floor, their pages torn and scattered like autumn leaves. The desk has been overturned with such force that one of its legs has splintered. Papers cover every surface, and on the walls, written in what appears to be the same dark ink used in the medieval manuscript, or is it ink, are symbols that Watson recognizes from the sealed crypt door, protective marks, warnings, prayers rendered in Latin and other languages he cannot identify. But it is what lies in the centre of the floor that stops them all in their tracks. The safe stands open and empty, its door hanging at an odd angle, as though wrenched open by impossible strength. And on the floor before it, arranged with careful precision, are 3 items: Blackwood's spectacles, carefully folded, his pocket watch, stopped at precisely midnight, and a single white lily, the flower traditionally associated with death and funerals. On the desk, weighted down by a stone that seems to have been taken from ancient ruins, is a note written in that same archaic hand they saw on the warning Blackwood received. Holmes picks it up carefully, and in the flickering gaslight of the ransacked office, he reads aloud words that seem to carry the chill of centuries. Mr. Holmes, the manuscript has been reclaimed. Professor Blackwood remains my guest until All Hallows Eve at midnight, when both he and the Chronicle of Brother Sebastian will be returned to their proper place. You are invited to attend this restoration, should you dare. Come to St. Dunstan's in the east at the appointed hour, descend to the sealed crypt and bear witness. But come warned, those who disturb the Nosferatu face consequences that extend beyond a single lifetime. The choice, as always, is yours. O. The fog outside the window seems to press closer, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell begins to toll the hour. Its sound muffled and strange, as though time itself has become uncertain in this fog-bound city, where the past refuses to remain buried, and where tomorrow night, at midnight, mysteries centuries old will demand their resolution in the darkness beneath an ancient church. Reviewing previous narrative parts for continuity. Inspector Lestrade stands with his hands clasped betans, with his hands clasped behind his back, rocking slightly on his heels, in that characteristic way Watson has observed during their previous collaborations with Scotland Yard. The detective's face bears an expression caught somewhere between professional skepticism and genuine unease, his eyes moving repeatedly to the symbols on the walls, as though hoping they might reveal their meaning through sheer force of staring. Behind him, 2 constables conduct a methodical search of the office, carefully documenting the chaos with notebooks and pencil sketches, though their movements carry a hesitation that suggests they would prefer to be investigating ordinary burglaries in well-lit districts, rather than this peculiar scene with its suggestions of ancient malevolence. Holmes circles the room slowly, his hands held behind his back, his sharp gaze moving across every surface, with the intensity of a man reading a complex text written in a language only he understands. He pauses at the overturned desk, kneeling to examine the splintered leg, running his long fingers along the break, testing the wood's resistance. Watson watches his friend work, recognizing the signs of Holmes's remarkable mind, assembling data, constructing theories, discarding impossibilities until only truth remains, however improbable that truth might prove to be. The safe was not picked, Holmes announces suddenly, his voice carrying clearly through the room and causing one of the constables to start slightly. Nor was it opened with the proper combination. Observe here, Lestrade. The door has been wrenched from its hinges with considerable force. The metal is bent, not cut or broken, but actually deformed by tremendous pressure applied to specific points. This would require strength far exceeding normal human capability, or, alternatively, the use of mechanical leverage tools, which would have left different marks than what we observe. The window shows no signs of forced entry, Holmes continues, speaking as much to himself as to his audience. Yet Blackwood swore he saw a face here, at a height that should be inaccessible. Either he suffered a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the suggestive power of the manuscript he was translating, or someone succeeded in reaching this window by means we have not yet identified. He straightens, turning to face the room. Lestrade, have your men searched the exterior of the building? Are there any structures nearby from which someone might have gained access? Fire escapes, adjacent buildings, scaffolding? The inspector shakes his head. We conducted a thorough examination when we arrived, Mr. Holmes. The courtyard below is clear, and the nearest building is more than 30 feet distant. There is no ladder long enough stored anywhere in the museum, and the staff insist that no scaffolding has been erected in this area for months. As far as we can determine, there is no physical means by which anyone could have reached this window from outside. Watson moves closer to the 3 items arranged on the floor: the spectacles, the pocket watch, the white lily. Something about their careful placement speaks of ritual, of symbolic significance beyond mere theft. The lily in particular troubles him, for its petals remain fresh and white, despite being in this closed room, suggesting it was placed recently, perhaps even within the past few hours. He bends to examine it more closely and catches a scent that makes him pause. Not the expected floral fragrance, but something else, something cold and earthy, like the smell of ancient stones or crypts long sealed. Holmes, he calls softly, and his friend immediately crosses to join him. This flower, it smells wrong, not decay, but something else, something old. Holmes kneels beside him, bringing his face close to the lily, inhaling deeply. His eyes widen fractionally, and when he speaks, his voice carries a note of surprise. Earth, he murmurs, very old earth, undisturbed for decades, if not centuries. This flower was not purchased from any London florist, Watson. It was grown in soil that has not seen sunlight or rain in living memory. He carefully lifts the lily by its stem, examining its roots, which still cling to dark, crumbling earth. This came from the crypt. Count Orlok brought this directly from beneath St. Dunstan's in the east, perhaps to prove that he has access to that sealed space, perhaps as a calling card, a signature written in symbols rather than words. A sudden commotion in the hallway outside draws their attention, voices raised in protest, followed by firm footsteps approaching despite the objections. The door swings wider and a figure enters, moving with such authority that even Lestrade steps aside instinctively. The newcomer is a woman of perhaps 40 years, dressed in the practical dark clothing of a scholar or professional, her greying hair pulled back severely from a face that speaks of intelligence and determination. She carries a leather satchel, and her eyes, behind wire-rimmed spectacles, remarkably similar to Blackwood's, sweep the ransacked office with an expression of horror barely held in check. "I am Dr. Margaret Ashworth," she announces, her voice steady, despite the visible distress her face betrays. "Professor Blackwood's research assistant and colleague. I received a message from the museum director regarding what has occurred. Where is Professor Blackwood? What has happened here?" Holmes rises, his manner immediately courteous and gentle, in the way Watson knows his friend reserves for those genuinely affected by tragedy or crisis. "Miss Ashworth, I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is Dr. Watson. Professor Blackwood has disappeared under circumstances we are still working to understand. I realize this must be deeply distressing, but I must ask, did the professor confide in you about the manuscript he was translating? Did he mention anything unusual about it, or about visitors he may have received? Dr. Ashworth sets down her satchel and moves to right the overturned desk chair, sitting heavily as though her legs can no longer support her. Her hands tremble slightly as she removes her gloves, and Watson's medical training prompts him to pour water from the carafe on the shelf, miraculously unbroken despite the chaos, offering it to her with a physician's practiced kindness. "Thank you, Doctor," she says, accepting the glass and taking a small sip. "Yes, Cornelius, Professor Blackwood, told me about the manuscript. He was quite excited about it initially, before the fear set in. He said it was one of the most remarkable documents he had ever examined, a genuine 15th century chronicle with illuminations of extraordinary quality. But then," she pauses, her composure wavering. "But then he began to change. He became secretive, anxious, jumping at shadows. He stopped coming to the faculty dining room, preferring to take his meals alone in his office. 3 days ago, he asked me not to come to the office for the remainder of the week. Said he needed to concentrate on a particularly difficult translation without interruption. I was hurt, I confess, but I respected his wishes. Now I see that he was trying to protect me from whatever this is." She gestures at the symbols covering the walls, and Watson sees tears gathering in her eyes, though she blinks them back with visible effort. "Mr. Holmes, you must understand. Cornelius Blackwood is not a fanciful man. He does not believe in ghosts or supernatural phenomena. He is a scholar, a rationalist, someone who has devoted his life to understanding the past through careful examination of evidence. For him to have become so frightened that he would ransack his own office and disappear." She cannot finish the sentence. "Dr. Ashworth," Holmes says carefully, "I must ask you to think back over the past week. Did you observe anyone unusual showing interest in Professor Blackwood or his work? Any foreign visitors to the museum? Anyone asking specifically about medieval manuscripts, particularly those dealing with Eastern European folklore?" She considers the question, her brow furrowing. "There are always scholars and researchers coming through, Mr. Holmes. The British Museum attracts visitors from across Europe and beyond. But now that you mention it, there was one gentleman who seemed particularly interested in Cornelius's area of expertise. A tall man, very pale, with an accent I could not quite place. He came by the office twice last week, though Cornelius was out both times. He left his card, said he would return, but I don't recall seeing him again." She looks up suddenly, her eyes widening. "I still have the card. I meant to give it to Cornelius, but it slipped my mind. It's in my desk in my office down the hall." She rises quickly, moving toward the door with renewed purpose, and Holmes follows immediately, Watson close behind. They proceed down the corridor to another office, smaller than Blackwood's, but equally filled with books and papers. Dr. Ashworth goes directly to her desk and begins searching through a small wooden box that contains visiting cards and correspondence. After a moment, she produces a card and hands it to Holmes with a slight tremor in her fingers. The card is unusual, black with silver lettering, and the paper stock feels oddly textured, almost like vellum. Holmes holds it up to catch the light from the gas lamp, and Watson reads over his shoulder. "Count Orlock, antiquarian and collector of medieval curiosities. Temporary residence, Spitalfields, London." No street address is provided, No specific location beyond the district name. Holmes turns the card over, examining both sides minutely, then holds it close to his nose, inhaling deeply. Whatever he detects causes a slight tightening around his eyes, a subtle change in expression that Watson has learned to interpret as confirmation of a suspicion. This card was printed on vellum, Holmes says quietly, and the ink contains unusual compounds, iron gall mixed with something else, something organic that I cannot immediately identify. The card itself feels old, despite the fact that it references a temporary London residence, suggesting recent creation. It is as though Count Orlok wished to create calling cards that would appear to belong to a much earlier century, as though he cannot quite help but reveal his connection to the past, even in such mundane items as visiting cards. Dr. Ashworth looks between them, confusion and fear warring in her expression. Who is this Count Orlok? Does he have something to do with Cornelius's disappearance? Before Holmes can answer, a distant sound reaches them through the museum's corridors. The front entrance doors closing with their characteristic heavy thud, followed by footsteps approaching rapidly. They are not the measured footsteps of museum staff or the cautious tread of Lestrade's constables, but something different. Swift, purposeful, multiple sets of feet moving in coordination. Holmes's hand moves to his pocket, where Watson knows he keeps his own revolver, and Watson finds his fingers closing around the grip of his service weapon, drawing strange comfort from its solid weight. A young constable appears at the office door, his face flushed from running. "Inspector Lestrade, sir. There's been another development. A message was just delivered to the front desk, addressed to Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The courier who brought it was most insistent it be delivered immediately, and then he vanished into the fog before we could question him properly." Lestrade takes the envelope from the constable and passes it to Holmes, who examines it briefly before breaking the seal. The paper inside is the same vellum as the visiting card, and the handwriting is the precise, archaic script they have come to recognize. Holmes reads aloud, his voice carrying clearly through the small office. "My dear Mr. Holmes, by now you have discovered my small rearrangement of Professor Blackwood's workspace and the recovery of property that belongs by ancient right beneath St. Dunstan's. Do not concern yourself overmuch with the Professor's well-being. He remains comfortable, if somewhat confined, and will be returned unharmed provided you do not attempt anything foolish before tomorrow's midnight hour. However, I grow weary of this game of shadows and suggestion. If you truly wish to understand what you are facing, come to Spitalfields tonight. Seek the oldest house on Princelet Street, the one that all the living avoid, though they cannot say precisely why. Come after darkness falls completely, and come alone, or with only Dr. Watson, whose courage I have observed, and whose presence I will permit. But come forewarned, Mr. Holmes. In my house, the rules of your rational world do not entirely apply. What you will see may challenge every assumption upon which you have built your reputation. The choice, as I have said before, is yours. But if you wish to save Professor Blackwood, you must first understand what it is you are attempting to save him from. I shall expect you at 9 o'clock. Do not be late. I find unpunctuality tiresome, and I have already waited so very, very long. Yours in anticipation, Count Orlok. Holmes folds the letter carefully and tucks it into his pocket. When he speaks, his voice is calm, measured, carrying that quality of absolute determination that Watson has heard before only in their most dangerous moments. Inspector Lestrade, I must ask you to maintain watch over this office, and to see Dr. Ashworth safely home. Watson and I have an appointment to keep. It seems Count Orlok has tired of indirect communication and wishes to meet us on his own ground. And while I recognize this is almost certainly a trap of some variety, it is also an opportunity to gather information that may prove crucial to rescuing Professor Blackwood before tomorrow's deadline. Watson checks his pocket watch. It is just past 6 o'clock, giving them 3 hours before the appointed meeting. 3 hours to prepare, to arm themselves, to steel their nerves for whatever awaits them in the oldest house on Princelet Street, where the Count has promised them a glimpse behind the veil of rational explanation. 3 hours before they walk deliberately into the lair of something that may be man or may be monster, but is certainly dangerous, and certainly holding all the advantages of preparation and home ground. Watson methodically checks his revolver for the 3rd time, counting cartridges that he knows are already loaded, the ritual providing comfort through its familiarity. 6 shots, each one capable of stopping any mortal man, yet against what they may face tonight. He wonders if 600 would suffice. Holmes, meanwhile, has assembled an unusual collection of items on the table. A silver crucifix, borrowed from Mrs. Hudson's personal effects. A vial of what he claims is holy water, obtained from a Catholic church near Trafalgar Square. Several cloves of garlic, purchased from a street vendor, and a small mirror in a silver frame. Watson observes these preparations with mingled amusement and unease, for they are the traditional defences against vampires drawn from folklore and superstition, items his rational friend would normally dismiss with scorn. I see you preparing for the supernatural, Holmes, Watson observes, his tone carefully neutral. Do you truly believe we will need such protections? Or are these merely insurance against possibilities you consider unlikely but cannot entirely discount? Holmes finishes wrapping the items in a cloth and tucking them into his coat pocket before responding. His face, illuminated by firelight, appears both thoughtful and troubled, as though he wrestles with conclusions his mind has reached, but his reason resists accepting. Let us say, Watson, that I am adopting a position of practical agnosticism. I do not know what Count Orlok truly is, whether he is a madman with theatrical flair, a criminal mastermind employing elaborate misdirection, or something that exists outside the comfortable categories of Victorian science. But I do know that he has gone to considerable effort to create the impression of supernatural agency, and when dealing with an adversary who controls the narrative so completely, it seems prudent to prepare for all contingencies, however fantastical they may appear. A knock at the door interrupts them, and Mrs. Hudson enters, bearing a tray with sandwiches and a thermos of strong tea. Her round face carries an expression of maternal concern that makes Watson's heart tighten slightly, for she clearly senses they are embarking on something more dangerous than their usual investigations. She sets the tray down and fusses with the sandwiches, rearranging them unnecessarily, clearly wanting to speak but uncertain what to say. "You'll be careful, won't you, Mr. Holmes?" she finally manages, her Scottish accent thickened by emotion. "Only, I couldn't help overhearing some of what you've been discussing, and it sounds most peculiar. Most peculiar indeed. I've lived in London all my life, and there are some corners of this city that decent folk avoid for good reason, and Spitalfields is one of them, especially after dark." Holmes crosses to her and takes her hand gently, a gesture of affection Watson has rarely witnessed. "We shall exercise every caution, Mrs. Hudson, and we shall return before midnight, I promise you. Watson and I have faced dangerous men before, and emerged unscathed, or, at least, reasonably so. This Count Orlok, whatever else he may be, is still bound by the same physical laws as any other creature that walks the earth." At 8:30, they don their coats and depart Baker Street. The cab ride through fog-shrouded London feels like a descent through layers of reality, each street taking them further from the familiar world of rationality and order. They pass through the West End with its theatres and restaurants, their windows glowing warmly, music and laughter spilling briefly into the street before being swallowed by fog. Then eastward through the city with its banks and offices, now shuttered and dark, the temples of commerce sleeping until morning's resurrection, and finally into Whitechapel, where poverty and desperation have left their marks on every building, where narrow streets twist upon themselves like a maze designed to trap the unwary. Princelet Street reveals itself as a thoroughfare that time has forgotten, lined with Georgian houses that lean wearily against each other, their facades dark with soot and neglect. Many stand empty, their windows broken and boarded, while others show signs of habitation so marginal it seems less like living and more like merely postponing death. The cab driver grows increasingly reluctant as they penetrate deeper into the street, finally refusing to continue beyond a certain point, claiming his horse has gone lame, though Watson can observe no such injury. "This is as far as I go, gentlemen," the driver says firmly, accepting his fare with hands that tremble slightly. "You want to go further down Princelet Street. You'll be walking, and I'd advise against it, if you're asking my opinion. There's a house down there, oldest one on the street, they say, and it's got a feeling about it that ain't natural. Folks cross the street to avoid passing too close, though most couldn't tell you why if you asked. Just a feeling, they'd say. Just a bad feeling." They dismount and watch the cab vanish quickly into the fog, its departure leaving them alone on a street where no other soul seems to stir. The gas lamps here are spaced further apart and burn with less vigour, as though even municipal services have given up on fully illuminating this forsaken corner of London. Watson draws his coat tighter against a chill that seems to penetrate beyond mere physical cold, settling into bones and spirit alike. Holmes consults his pocket watch, 10 minutes before 9 o'clock. "The oldest house," the driver said. "That would be at the end of the street, I should think, where the buildings date to the early 18th century rather than the 19th. Come, Watson, Count Orlok awaits, and whatever his nature, he has demonstrated a preference for punctuality." They walk slowly down Princelet Street, their footsteps echoing off wet cobblestones, the fog swirling around them in patterns that seem almost purposeful, as though it parts to reveal their path before closing behind them like a door. The houses they pass show no signs of life, no lights in windows, no sounds of habitation, no smoke from chimneys despite the cold evening. It is as though this entire street has been abandoned, left to decay quietly, while the city grows and changes around it. At the street's terminus, set back slightly from its neighbours, stands a house that could only be described as ancient. 3 stories of dark brick, its windows narrow and set deep in the walls, its door of heavy oak banded with iron that has oxidized to a rich brown rather than rust. The architecture predates even the surrounding Georgian buildings, suggesting origins in the late 17th century or earlier. No light shows from within, yet something about the building suggests habitation. Not abandonment, but rather occupancy of a type that requires no conventional illumination. As they approach, the door swings open silently, revealing darkness within. No servant appears to greet them, no voice calls welcome, only that yawning darkness, and the suggestion of a hallway extending into unlit depths. Holmes pauses at the threshold, and Watson sees his friend's hand move to touch the pocket containing the crucifix and garlic, seeking reassurance from those ancient protections. "Together, Watson," Holmes murmurs. "Whatever we find within, we remain together." They cross the threshold, and the door closes behind them with a soft click that seems to echo with finality. For a moment, they stand in complete darkness, and then, one by one, candles begin to light themselves throughout the hallway. Or at least, they appear to light themselves, for Watson can see no hand holding flame to wick. The illumination reveals a corridor of remarkable preservation, as though this house exists somehow outside the decay that claims its neighbours. The wooden panelling gleams darkly, the floor is swept clean, and portraits line the walls. Portraits of men and women in clothing that spans centuries, from Elizabethan ruffs to Georgian wigs to more recent Victorian dress. At the corridor's end, a figure emerges from shadow into candlelight. Count Orlok, dressed in black that seems to absorb the light rather than reflect it, his pale face floating above his clothing like a mask suspended in darkness. He moves toward them with that peculiar grace Watson noticed at the church, his footsteps making no sound upon the wooden floor. And when he speaks, his voice carries a warmth that somehow makes his words more unsettling, rather than less. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, how punctual. I do so appreciate punctuality. It is one of the few virtues that has remained constant across the centuries, regardless of fashion or philosophy. Please, follow me. I have prepared refreshments in the drawing room, and we have much to discuss before your midnight appointment tomorrow at St. Dunstan's." He turns and glides down the corridor, and after exchanging a glance, Holmes and Watson follow. The portraits they pass seem to watch them with painted eyes, and Watson could swear he sees one, a woman in Tudor dress, turn her head slightly to track their movement, though when he looks directly at her, she remains frozen in oils and canvas. The house smells of age, but not decay, of old wood and older stone, and underneath it all, that same scent Watson noticed on the lily, earth that has not known sun or rain in living memory. The drawing room into which Count Orlok leads them is appointed with furniture and decorations that span multiple centuries in chaotic harmony. A medieval tapestry hangs beside a Georgian mirror, which reflects a Renaissance painting of a mountain monastery that makes Watson's breath catch, for it is unmistakably the same monastery depicted in the manuscript's illuminations. Chairs and divans are arranged around a fireplace where logs burn with flames that give off heat but somehow seem to cast less light than they should, creating a warm dimness rather than bright illumination. On a low table between the chairs sits a service of tea, or rather of a dark liquid in a crystal decanter, accompanied by glasses of antique cut crystal. Count Orlok gestures to the chairs with a host's practiced courtesy, seating himself only after his guests have settled. Watson notices that the Count's chair is positioned so that his back remains to the mirror, and when he glances at that reflective surface, his blood runs cold. For while Holmes and Watson are clearly visible in the glass. The Count's chair appears empty, occupied by nothing but shadow and suggestion. I see you have noticed my peculiar relationship with mirrors, Count Orlok says, his voice carrying amusement tinged with something darker. An old affliction, shall we say. The Church taught that mirrors reflect the soul, and perhaps they were more correct than they knew. What happens, Mr. Holmes, when one has surrendered one's soul for the sake of continuation? What does the mirror show then? Nothing, as you observe. Or perhaps everything. Perhaps mirrors show the truth that lies beneath appearances, and the truth about me is simply absence. Holmes leans forward slightly, his grey eyes intent upon their host. Count Orlok, I confess I am weary of theatrical mystification. You have gone to extraordinary lengths to create an impression of supernatural agency, the impossible appearance at Blackwood's window, your knowledge of sealed crypts, your ability to move unseen through London, these parlour tricks with lighting and mirrors. But I am a man who deals in evidence and rational explanation. If you wish my cooperation tomorrow night, you will answer plainly. What are you, and what do you want with the manuscript and Professor Blackwood? The Count's smile widens, revealing teeth that are indeed unnaturally white, and perhaps, in the uncertain light, slightly too prominent, too sharp. He rises and moves to the fireplace, resting one pale hand upon the mantel, and in profile his features take on an almost predatory cast. The high forehead, the sharp nose, the thin lips drawn back from those disturbing teeth. What am I? He repeats softly, and suddenly the flames in the fireplace surge upward, casting wild shadows that dance across the walls like living things. I am what the Chronicle of Brother Sebastian describes, Mr. Holmes. I am Nosferatu. I am the thing that your science refuses to acknowledge, that your rational age has relegated to folklore and peasant superstition. I am 543 years old, and I have been both man and monster, both predator and prince. I am hunger given form, necessity elevated to philosophy, survival elevated to art form. He turns to face them fully, and his eyes catch the firelight in that impossible way, glowing with inner luminescence. The manuscript that Professor Blackwood translated, it tells a true history. In 1462, I and others of my kind sought refuge in a Carpathian monastery, hoping to find peace, perhaps redemption. Instead, we brought only death and terror. Brother Sebastian survived to chronicle our presence, and his account was copied, preserved, passed down as warning. One such copy found its way to England in the 18th century, brought by a trader who did not understand what he carried. It was placed in the crypt of St. Dunstan's for safekeeping, sealed away with other things that London wished to forget. Watson finds his voice, though it emerges rougher than he intends. And you wish to retrieve it, to destroy evidence of your existence. Count Orlok laughs, a sound like wind through dead trees. Destroy it? No, Dr. Watson. I wish to return it to its proper home, beneath that church where it has rested for over a century. For you see, the manuscript is not merely a historical document. It is a covenant, a binding sealed in blood and blessed earth, a promise made by my kind to remain apart from humanity, to limit our predations, to exist in shadow rather than openly in the world. By removing it from the crypt, Professor Blackwood broke that covenant, and broken covenants have consequences. The fire gutters suddenly, plunging the room into near darkness. And when it flares again moments later, Count Orlok has moved, impossibly fast, inhumanly fast, to stand directly before Holmes's chair, looming over the detective, with eyes that burn with ancient hunger barely restrained. Tomorrow night, at midnight on All Hallows Eve, the manuscript will be returned. Professor Blackwood will speak the words of restoration, and you, Mr. Holmes, you and Dr. Watson will bear witness. This is not negotiable. This is not a request. This is the price of his life and the condition of continued peace between my kind and yours. Do you understand? In the terrible silence that follows, broken only by the crackling of flames and the distant sound of fog-muffled church bells tolling 9 o'clock, Watson realizes they have reached the heart of the mystery. And that heart is darker, stranger, and infinitely more dangerous than anything his rational mind was prepared to accept. Holmes remains seated with remarkable composure, despite Count Orlok's proximity, though Watson observes his friend's hand has moved subtly toward the pocket containing their makeshift arsenal of folkloric protections. The detective's face, illuminated by the uncertain firelight, betrays neither fear nor belief, but rather maintains that expression of intense calculation Watson has witnessed countless times, the look of a mind racing through possibilities, testing hypotheses against observed phenomena, refusing to surrender to panic or premature conclusions, even when confronted with evidence that challenges every foundation of rational thought. Your performance is impressive, Count, Holmes says evenly, his voice steady and measured. The sudden movements, the reflectionless mirror, the theatrics with flame and shadow, all very effective in creating atmosphere. But I have built my reputation upon distinguishing between what appears to be impossible and what is merely improbable, achieved through clever means. You wish me to believe you are a 500-year-old vampire. Very well. Prove it beyond theatrical suggestion. Show me something that cannot be explained by trapdoors, confederates, optical illusions, or any of the 100 tricks employed by spiritualist mediums and stage magicians. For a long moment, Count Orlok remains motionless, his luminous eyes fixed upon Holmes, with an expression that mingles amusement with something that might be respect. Then, slowly, he extends one pale hand toward the fireplace. The flames respond immediately, surging upward until they nearly touch the ceiling, their heat suddenly intense enough to make both Holmes and Watson lean back in their chairs. Then, with a gesture like closing a fist, Orlok extinguishes every flame simultaneously, plunging the room into absolute darkness so complete that Watson cannot see his own hand before his face. In that darkness, the Count's voice comes from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating through the space, as though multiple voices speak in unsettling harmony. Light is a comfort to the living, Mr. Holmes, but I have not needed comfort for so very long. In darkness, I am most truly myself. In darkness, I see with senses you cannot imagine, perceive textures of reality your limited biology denies you access to. You want proof? Very well. A sound fills the room. Wings, hundreds of wings, the flutter and rush of creatures in flight. Watson feels air currents against his face, senses movement all around him, and then something brushes his shoulder, something small and leathery and alive. He suppresses a shout, his hand finding his revolver, though he knows firing blindly in this darkness would be worse than useless. Beside him, he hears Holmes's sharp intake of breath, a sound less of fear than of fascination tinged with genuine alarm. The darkness lifts as suddenly as it descended, light returning, not from the fireplace, but from the candles throughout the room, which ignite simultaneously with a soft, whooshing sound. Count Orlok stands exactly where he was before, but the room has transformed. Every surface, the furniture, the floor, the mantelpiece, even the walls, is covered with bats. Hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, their dark bodies packed so closely they seem to form a living carpet, their eyes reflecting candlelight in crimson pinpoints, their wings folded but ready. They make no sound beyond their breathing, a collective susurration that fills the air like whispered conversations in an unknown language. "These are my children," Orlok says softly, and at his words the bats begin to move, flowing across surfaces like dark water, reforming into patterns and shapes. My eyes when I cannot venture forth, my hands when I require reach beyond my own, my defense when threats arise. They are bound to me as surely as your blood is bound to your heart. This is not illusion, Mr. Holmes. This is the reality of what I am, a creature who exists partially in your world, and partially in realms your science has not yet discovered, a being who has learned to command aspects of nature that remain mysteries to your rational philosophy. With another gesture, the bats disperse, flowing toward windows that Watson had not noticed were open, streaming out into the London night in a dark river, until the room returns to its previous state of antique elegance, unmarred by any sign of their presence. The Count resumes his seat, crossing his legs in a gesture of aristocratic ease, though his eyes never leave Holmes's face, watching for reaction, for acknowledgement, for the moment when the great detective must admit the limits of his rational framework. Watson finds his voice, though it emerges shaken. "Dear God, Holmes, that was no trick. No illusion could account for what we just witnessed." But Holmes has risen and moved to the windows, examining the frames, running his fingers along the sills, his magnifying glass emerging from his pocket as he scrutinizes every detail. "Trained bats," he murmurs, though his voice carries less conviction than usual. Pavlovian conditioning, perhaps combined with ultrasonic signals inaudible to human ears. It would require years of preparation, extensive facilities, but theoretically possible. "Is it, Mr. Holmes?" Orlok asks, and there is something almost gentle in his tone now, almost sympathetic. "Is it truly possible, or are you constructing ever more elaborate explanations to avoid accepting a simpler truth, that the world contains wonders and horrors your science has not yet categorized? I do not ask you to abandon reason. I ask only that you expand your conception of what reason must encompass." A clock somewhere in the house begins to chime. 10 o'clock, each bell seeming to echo through rooms unseen, as though the building extends far beyond its physical dimensions. As the final chime fades, Orlok rises and moves to a writing desk in the corner, withdrawing from it a rolled parchment tied with black ribbon. He returns and places it on the table between them, the ancient vellum crackling slightly as he unrolls it to reveal text written in that same medieval script they have come to recognize from Brother Sebastian's chronicle. "This is the covenant I mentioned," Orlok explains, his pale fingers tracing lines of text with something approaching reverence. "Written in blood, my blood specifically, and sealed with earth from the monastery where our kind made our first compact with humanity. It stipulates that we shall remain hidden, shall limit our predations to those already dying, or those who consent, shall not create new members of our kind without grave necessity. In exchange, humanity agrees not to hunt us, not to desecrate our resting places, not to disturb the documents that record our existence. For nearly 200 years, this covenant has been honoured. The manuscript beneath St. Dunstan's is the physical embodiment of that agreement. When Professor Blackwood removed it, he did so unknowingly, but ignorance does not negate consequence. Holmes has returned to his chair, and Watson observes his friend's expression has shifted subtly from sceptical analysis to something more complex. Not quite acceptance, but perhaps the beginning of accommodation, the grudging admission that evidence may be leading toward conclusions his worldview resists. And if the manuscript is not returned, if this covenant, as you call it, remains broken, the Count's face darkens, and for the first time, Watson sees genuine emotion beyond theatrical menace or aristocratic amusement, weariness perhaps, or regret, or simply the weight of centuries bearing down upon features that should have returned to dust long ago. Then others of my kind, less restrained than myself, less willing to exist peacefully alongside humanity, will interpret it as permission to resume the old ways. There are Nosferatu in London, Mr. Holmes, in Paris, in Vienna, in every great city where sufficient population provides cover for our existence. Most of us wish only to endure, to experience the slow turning of ages, to find what meaning we can in our cursed continuation. But some remember when we were not hidden, when we ruled openly over terrified populations. The covenant keeps them in check. Without it, he does not finish, but the implication hangs heavy in the candlelit air. Watson thinks of London's millions, of the great crowds that throng the streets by day, that fill theatres and restaurants by night, of all those beating hearts and flowing veins, and he imagines predators moving among them unrestrained, selecting victims as humans might select fruit from market stalls. The image makes him shudder despite the fire's warmth. Why Blackwood? Watson asks suddenly. Why choose him specifically to receive the manuscript? Surely there are other scholars, other medievalists who might have translated it. Count Orlok's smile returns, though it carries sadness now rather than menace. Professor Blackwood is descended, through his mother's line, from Reverend Ashworth, the very vicar who sealed the crypt in 1751. Blood calls to blood across generations, Dr. Watson. When a covenant is broken, it falls to the descendants of those who made it to restore what was sundered. I did not choose Blackwood arbitrarily. I chose him because his family's blood binds him to this matter, whether he knows it or not. Only he can speak the words of restoration. Only his voluntary participation can renew the covenant and prevent the chaos that its breaking would unleash. Holmes has been silent throughout this exchange, his sharp mind clearly processing, analyzing, constructing frameworks that can accommodate these impossible revelations. When he finally speaks, his voice carries a new quality, not defeat, but rather acceptance of a broader battlefield than he anticipated. Very well, Count Orlok. Let us suppose, for the sake of argument, that I accept your account. Let us suppose that you are indeed what you claim to be, that this covenant is real, and that Professor Blackwood must participate in this restoration. What guarantee do we have that he will not be harmed? What prevents you from simply taking what you want and disposing of witnesses? The Count rises and moves to one of the room's windows, gazing out at the fog-wrapped street. When he responds, his voice carries across the room with the weight of absolute truth, or, at least, absolute sincerity. Because I am not a monster, Mr. Holmes, despite what I have become. Or rather, I am a monster who has chosen to be something else, something more. I have lived through centuries of blood and darkness, and I have learned that survival without honor is merely extended death. I give you my word, and the word of the Nosferatu, once given, has never in 500 years been broken, that Professor Blackwood will be returned to you unharmed once the ceremony is complete. More than that, I promise that neither you nor Dr. Watson will suffer any harm at my hands, regardless of what occurs tomorrow night. He turns back to face them, and in his ancient eyes, Watson sees something unexpected. Loneliness, perhaps, or the accumulated isolation of centuries lived in shadow, watching human lives flicker past like candle flames while he endures, unchanging and unchanged. I do not ask you to like me, gentlemen. I do not even ask you to trust me completely. I ask only that you recognize we share a common goal, the preservation of the fragile peace that allows both our kinds to coexist. Tomorrow night at St. Dunstan's, we restore what was broken, and then, God willing, we return to our separate spheres and trouble each other no more. A sudden sound from above, footsteps, heavy and slow, descending stairs they cannot see, makes all three men look upward. The ceiling creaks under substantial weight, and Watson's hand moves again to his revolver, though he knows with growing certainty that bullets would provide scant protection against whatever dwells in this house. The footsteps reach the ground floor and approach the drawing room, accompanied now by laboured breathing, by the shuffle of feet that drag rather than lift. The door opens and Professor Blackwood enters, but a Blackwood transformed from the terrified man who visited Baker Street days ago. He walks with the stiff movements of someone under powerful sedation, or perhaps hypnotic influence. His eyes open but unfocused, his face pale but unmarked by injury. He wears the same clothing he wore when he disappeared from the museum, though it is now rumpled and stained with earth, that same ancient earth whose smell has haunted this entire investigation. Cornelius! Watson leaps to his feet, medical training overriding caution as he rushes to support the professor. But Blackwood seems barely aware of his presence, his gaze fixed on something invisible to normal sight, his lips moving silently as though reciting memorized text. Count Orlok watches this reunion with an expression of clinical interest. As you can see, Professor Blackwood remains alive and fundamentally unharmed. I have been preparing him, shall we say, for tomorrow's ceremony, teaching him the words he must speak, showing him visions of what depends upon his cooperation. He will recover fully once the ritual is complete, though I suspect his memories of this time will be mercifully vague, like a dream half remembered upon waking. Holmes has joined Watson beside Blackwood, examining the professor with practiced efficiency, checking pulse, pupil dilation, response to stimulus. He has been drugged, Holmes announces. Some powerful narcotic, combined perhaps with suggestion and sensory deprivation. The earth stains suggest he has been kept underground, possibly in the crypt itself. Precisely, Mr. Holmes. The professor has been my guest beneath St. Dunstan's, learning the weight of history, understanding the stakes of tomorrow's restoration. Orlok moves closer, and Watson instinctively steps between him and Blackwood, his revolver now openly displayed, though his hand does not yet point it at the Count. Peace, Dr. Watson. I mean him no further harm. In fact, I return him to your care for the remaining hours until midnight tomorrow. Take him to Baker Street. Let him rest. Let him eat and drink and remember what it means to be alive and human. Then, at 11:45 tomorrow night, bring him to St. Dunstan's in the east. The door will be open. Descend to the crypt. You will find the chains mysteriously loosened, the seals mysteriously broken, and there, in that space where earth meets stone, where past meets present, we will restore what must be restored. He produces a key from his pocket, ancient iron, ornate and heavy, and presses it into Holmes's hand. This opens the final door, the one beyond the chains. Use it at the appointed hour. And gentlemen, his voice drops to barely above a whisper, though it carries clearly through the room. Come armed if it comforts you. Come with your crucifixes and your holy water and your silver bullets forged under full moons. But come with the understanding that what you will witness tomorrow night exists beyond such protections, beyond the simple categories of good and evil your morality constructs. You will see the restoration of a covenant between species, between worlds, between the dying age of superstition and the new age of reason that believes it has banished all shadows. And perhaps, if you are very fortunate, you will understand that some shadows serve a purpose. Some darkness protects as surely as light reveals. The candles throughout the room gutter simultaneously, and in the moment of near darkness, Watson feels more than sees movement around them. When light returns a heartbeat later, they are standing in the entrance hallway, Professor Blackwood supported between them, the drawing room door closed as though it had never opened. Count Orlok has vanished, though his voice echoes from somewhere unseen, carrying through the old house like wind through abandoned corridors. Until tomorrow night, gentlemen, until the witching hour, when worlds grow thin and ancient, promises come due. Sleep well, if you can. Dream peacefully, if such peace remains possible. And remember, you bear witness not as judges, but as guarantors, as representatives of your kind, watching as mine fulfills its obligations. Tomorrow night, at St. Dunstan's in the east, the Nosferatu will honour its covenant. Will humanity honour theirs? The front door swings open of its own accord, revealing Princelet Street, wreathed in fog that seems thicker than ever, moving with purposeful currents as though living things swim through it. Holmes and Watson help Blackwood across the threshold, and the moment all three stand on the cobblestones outside, the door closes with a finality that suggests they will not be permitted entry again until the appointed hour. They stand in the street with the professor between them, and Watson realizes he is trembling. Not from cold, not from fear exactly, but from the accumulated weight of everything they have witnessed, everything they have learned, everything their rational minds struggle to accommodate. Somewhere in the fog, a church bell begins to toll 11 o'clock, each peal seeming to count down the hours until tomorrow's midnight, until the moment when all mysteries will be resolved and all debts will come due in the darkness beneath an ancient church, where things that should not exist have waited with inhuman patience for their covenant to be restored. Orchestrating final resolution and covenant restoration ceremony. All Hallows Eve arrives with the kind of silence that feels expectant, as though London itself holds its breath, waiting for night to fall and mysteries to reveal themselves. Watson wakes in his own bed at Baker Street to find pale morning light filtering through curtains. The fog having finally lifted enough to allow weak sunshine through, though clouds remain heavy overhead, like grey wool stretched across the sky. For a moment he lies still, wondering if the previous night was merely nightmare or fever dream. The house on Princelet Street, the impossible bats, Count Orlok's luminous eyes promising truths that shatter comfortable certainties. But then he hears movement from the sitting room, voices speaking in low tones, and memory returns with the weight of absolute reality. He dresses quickly and emerges to find Holmes already awake, or perhaps never having slept, seated at the breakfast table with Professor Blackwood. The professor appears significantly recovered from his stupor, eating toast and drinking tea with the mechanical movements of someone performing familiar rituals to anchor himself to normalcy. His eyes, though clearer than last night, carry shadows that speak of things witnessed in darkness, knowledge gained that cannot be entirely forgotten, even if details blur. Mrs. Hudson moves about the room, tidying with unusual energy, her way of coping with tension by imposing order on whatever she can control. "Good morning, Watson," Holmes greets him, though his voice carries weariness that belies the courtesy. Professor Blackwood has been recounting what he remembers of his captivity. The account is fragmentary, but illuminating. It seems Count Orlok was quite truthful about keeping him in the crypt beneath St. Dunstan's, though the professor's memories of how he arrived there remain vague. Drugs, most likely, combined with that peculiar hypnotic influence we observed. Blackwood sets down his teacup with trembling hands. "I remember Earth," he says softly, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Cold Earth surrounding me, not burying me, but embracing me, as though the ground itself was alive and aware. And I remember voices, Count Orlok's primarily, but others as well, speaking in languages I should not understand, yet somehow comprehended. They were teaching me words, ancient words in Latin and older tongues, words I must speak tonight when—" He trails off, his face paling further. Watson pours himself tea and sits, his medical instincts cataloguing the professor's symptoms. Mild shock, exhaustion, possible malnutrition, but nothing that appears life-threatening. "What exactly are you to do tonight, Professor? What is this ceremony that requires your participation?" Holmes answers before Blackwood can speak. According to Count Orlok, the professor must voluntarily speak words of restoration, renewing the covenant that binds the Nosferatu to peaceful coexistence with humanity. The ceremony requires a descendant of Reverend Ashworth, the vicar who originally sealed the crypt, to formally acknowledge the covenant's binding nature and consent to its continuation. It is, in essence, a contract renewal, with Blackwood serving as humanity's representative. "But what if I refuse?" Blackwood asks suddenly, a spark of defiance breaking through his exhaustion. "What if I simply decline to participate? Count Orlok cannot force me to speak words I choose to withhold." The sitting room seems to grow colder, despite the fire burning in the hearth. Holmes meets the professor's gaze steadily, and Watson sees in his friend's expression a rare combination of sympathy and absolute certainty. Then the covenant remains broken, and whatever restraints currently limit the activities of London's Nosferatu population will be lifted. Count Orlok suggested there are others of his kind, less civilized than himself. Do you truly wish to discover what they might do with their newfound freedom? How many deaths would result before new accommodations could be reached? The day passes with agonizing slowness, hours marked by church bells and the movements of shadows across walls as the sun tracks its invisible course behind clouds. They remain at Baker Street, none of them willing to venture out, as though maintaining proximity to each other provides protection against whatever the night might bring. Watson reads medical journals without absorbing their content. Holmes plays his violin, producing melodies that drift between melancholy and something approaching dread. Blackwood mostly sits, staring into the fire, occasionally touching his neck, as though checking for wounds that are not there. Mrs. Hudson brings lunch, then tea, then finally an early dinner. None of them eat with any real appetite. As darkness begins its inevitable descent, they prepare themselves like soldiers before battle. Watson checks his revolver for perhaps the 20th time. Holmes arranges the items in his pocket: the crucifix, the garlic, the holy water, though Watson suspects his friend places little faith in their efficacy beyond psychological comfort. Blackwood dons his coat with movements of a man approaching his own execution, though whether he fears death or something worse, Watson cannot say. At 11:30, they depart Baker Street, walking rather than taking a cab, for the fog has returned with nightfall, and drivers prove reluctant to venture toward their destination. The streets are empty, All Hallows' Eve having driven most sensible folk indoors, away from a night when tradition warns that boundaries thin and dangerous things cross over. They walk in silence through the fog, their footsteps echoing, occasionally passing other figures who give them wide berth, as though recognizing purpose in their stride that marks them as participants in events best avoided. St. Dunstan's in the east materializes from the fog, like a ship emerging from mist, its tower rising into darkness where stars should be visible but are not. The churchyard gate stands open, though Watson cannot recall if they left it so during their previous visit. They walk between graves, whose markers lean at drunken angles, past stone angels, whose faces have been smoothed by centuries of rain, into expressions that might be peaceful or might be screaming. Impossible to tell in this light, in this fog, on this night when everything seems uncertain. The church door swings open at Holmes's touch, revealing an interior lit by what must be 1,000 candles. They stand on every surface, the windowsills, the pews, the floor itself, creating a sea of flame that casts dancing shadows across stone walls and vaulted ceiling. The effect is beautiful and terrible at once, transforming the church into something between cathedral and crypt, between holy space and something older, something that predates Christianity and its comfortable certainties. Count Orlok stands before the altar, dressed in robes that might have been worn 5 centuries ago, dark fabric embroidered with symbols in silver thread that seem to move in the uncertain light. He is not alone. Arranged throughout the church, standing perfectly still in the pews, are perhaps 24 figures. They vary in age and appearance. Some appear as young as 20, others might be elderly, but all share that same quality of unnatural stillness, that same luminous quality to their eyes, that same sense of being present, yet somehow separate from normal human existence. "Welcome, gentlemen," Orlok says, his voice carrying through the space without need for volume. "Welcome to the Restoration. You come as witnesses, as guarantors, as representatives of your kind who will remember what occurs this night and carry that memory forward, ensuring that the covenant we renew here remains honored by both our peoples." He gestures toward the door behind the altar. The way is open, the seals are broken, the crypt awaits. Shall we begin? They descend the stone stairs, the passage now lit by torches set in wall brackets, their flames casting wild shadows that seem to have independent life. The chamber at the bottom, where previously they found only chains and locks, now reveals an open doorway. Holmes produces the iron key Count Orlok gave him, though the door already stands ajar. Darkness beyond it absolute, and somehow hungry, as though whatever space lies past that threshold exists outside normal geometry. Orlok takes a torch from the wall and steps through, and after exchanging glances, Holmes, Watson, and Blackwood follow. The crypt beyond exceeds anything Watson imagined. Not a simple vault, but a vast underground chamber, its ceiling supported by stone pillars carved with symbols that predate any language he recognizes. The walls are lined with alcoves, and in each alcove rests a coffin, some of stone, others of wood, so old it has turned nearly black. The air smells of earth and time and something else. Not decay exactly, but rather preservation, as though this space exists in suspension, neither fully in the world nor entirely beyond it. At the chamber's centre stands a stone altar, and upon that altar rests the manuscript, Brother Sebastian's Chronicle, opened to its final page where illuminated text glows in the torchlight. Surrounding the altar, the other Nosferatu have gathered, forming a circle, their faces solemn, their eyes reflecting flame like captured stars. They begin to hum, a sound without melody yet strangely beautiful, creating harmonics that resonate through the stone chamber and seem to make the very air vibrate. Count Orlok places his torch in a bracket and gestures for Blackwood to approach the altar. The professor moves forward with visible reluctance, his legs barely supporting him, and Watson moves to accompany him, unwilling to let their client face this alone. Holmes remains slightly back, observing everything, his detective's mind still cataloguing, still searching for the rational explanation, even as the evidence of his senses suggests they have moved beyond reason's comfortable domain. Professor Blackwood, Orlok intones, his voice taking on ceremonial weight. Descendant of Reverend Ashworth, who sealed this crypt in the year of our Lord 1751, you stand as representative of humanity. Before you lies the chronicle of Brother Sebastian, testimony to our existence, record of the covenant that binds our kinds to mutual peace. Speak now the words of restoration, given to you in earth and darkness, and renew the bond that your ancestor forged. Blackwood's lips move silently, as though practicing sounds his mouth fears to make. Then, in a voice that starts weak but grows stronger, he begins to speak in Latin, then in medieval German, then in other languages older still. Watson cannot understand the words, but their meaning resonates nonetheless. Acknowledgement, acceptance, agreement. The professor's voice fills the crypt, echoing off stone, and the humming of the assembled Nosferatu rises in response, creating a sound like wind through vast caverns, like the earth itself singing. As Blackwood speaks, something changes in the chamber. The candlelight seems to grow brighter, the shadows deeper, and Watson becomes aware of presences beyond the visible. Witnesses, perhaps, or memories, or the weight of all the centuries this covenant has endured. He feels a pressure against his chest, as though the very air has grown denser, charged with significance beyond his ability to fully comprehend. Blackwood's voice reaches a crescendo, speaking a final phrase that seems to hang in the air like thunder's echo. And then silence falls, absolute and profound. The manuscript on the altar glows briefly with inner light, or perhaps Watson's eyes deceive him, and then returns to being merely an ancient book, beautiful but no longer charged with that terrible significance. Count Orlok bows his head, and the assembled Nosferatu follow suit. When he looks up again, his face carries an expression of relief so profound it transforms his features, making him appear almost human, almost vulnerable. "It is done," he says softly. "The covenant is renewed. The balance is restored. You have our gratitude, Professor Blackwood, and our promise. You will not see us again, nor will any of your bloodline suffer attention from my kind unto the 7th generation." He lifts the manuscript from the altar with reverent hands and carries it to one of the alcoves, placing it carefully in a stone niche where it will rest, undisturbed and undisturbing, for another century or more. Then he turns back to his 3 human guests. "Our business is concluded. You have witnessed and borne testament. Return now to your world, to your rational daylight existence, and let this night become as dream, remembered but not quite believed, present but not quite real. And know that beneath your London, beneath all your great cities, we endure, we continue, kept in check by covenants such as this, by agreements that acknowledge we share this world, whether either kind finds that sharing comfortable." The assembled Nosferatu begin to withdraw, each moving toward their alcoves, their coffins, their places of rest. Count Orlok himself approaches his own resting place, pausing only to address them one final time. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, you sought rational explanation, and I have given you something far more disturbing, truth. Not all mysteries can be solved, only accommodated. Not all darkness can be illuminated, only accepted. Live well, gentlemen, live long, and should you be tempted to speak of what you have witnessed here, remember that belief requires evidence, and evidence of our kind vanishes like morning fog beneath your precious sun." He steps into his alcove, and heavy stone begins to slide across the opening, sealing him within. Throughout the crypt, other stones move similarly, coffin lids closing, darkness claiming its children. Within moments, Holmes, Watson, and Blackwood stand alone in a chamber that appears empty, ancient, undisturbed by any presence save their own, and the guttering torches that provide their only light. They ascend the stairs in silence, emerging into the church to find it transformed, the 1,000 candles extinguished, only normal lamplight remaining, the space feeling ordinary again, merely an old church in an old city on a night like any other. They walk through the empty nave, past pews that show no sign of recent occupation, and exit into a churchyard where fog has begun to lift, revealing stars beyond. London surrounds them, real, solid, comprehensible London, with its gas lamps and cobblestones and distant sounds of human activity. They walk slowly back toward Baker Street, none of them speaking, each processing in their own way what they have witnessed. As they walk, the night seems to lighten fractionally, as though dawn approaches early, though Watson's pocket watch shows only midnight. At Baker Street, they find Mrs. Hudson has waited up, hot tea and brandy prepared, the fire built high against the chill. They settle into their familiar chairs, and gradually, as warmth and normality seep back into their bones, conversation becomes possible again. Blackwood will sleep in the guest room tonight, and tomorrow return to his work at the British Museum, though he will submit no paper about the manuscript, will make no mention of what he translated or witnessed. Some knowledge, they agree, serves no purpose in the telling. As the clock approaches 2 a.m, Blackwood finally retires, and Watson finds himself alone with Holmes before the dying fire. His friend has been silent for nearly an hour, staring into flames, clearly wrestling with conclusions his rational mind resists, yet evidence compels him toward. "Holmes," Watson says quietly, "what do we believe? What do we accept about tonight?" Holmes is silent for so long, Watson thinks he will not answer. Then, finally, he speaks, his voice thoughtful, almost dreamy. "I believe, Watson, that we have encountered something that exists in the spaces between what we know and what we can prove. Whether Count Orlok is truly an immortal creature sustained by blood, or simply a man with access to resources and knowledge that create that impression, I cannot definitively say. But I know we witnessed something tonight, a ceremony, a covenant, an agreement between worlds or species, or whatever categories might apply. And I know that the world is larger, stranger, more filled with wonder and terror than our comfortable Victorian certainties acknowledge." He turns to face Watson, and in the firelight, his expression carries acceptance of mysteries unsolved. Some cases end with revelation and explanation. Others end with accommodation and wonder. This is the latter. And perhaps, my dear Watson, that is not entirely unsatisfying. A world that contains only what we can measure and dissect would be a poorer place than one that retains shadows, retains possibilities, retains spaces where ancient things might dwell if we are wise enough to leave them undisturbed. Outside, a church bell tolls 3 times, marking hours that slip toward dawn and a new day. Watson rises to bank the fire, to prepare for rest, to surrender finally to exhaustion that has been held at bay by adrenaline and fear and wonder. As he moves toward his bedroom, Holmes's voice stops him. "Watson, thank you for accompanying me tonight, for standing beside me in that crypt, for being the one constant in a world that insists on revealing itself as far more complex than reason prefers." Watson smiles, feeling warmth beyond what the fire provides. "Always, Holmes, in crypts or drawing rooms, in fog or sunshine, against mortal criminals or immortal mysteries. Always." And as sleep finally claims him, his last thought is that some stories end not with answers, but with peaceful acceptance that not all endings require complete understanding. Only trust that the world, strange and wondrous as it is, contains balances maintained by agreements older than memory, kept by beings we may never fully comprehend, protecting us all through their patient adherence to ancient promises made in darkness and kept in silence. Before you surrender to sleep yourself, dear listener, know that you have journeyed with us through fog and fear, through mystery and revelation, through the shadowed places where Victorian reason meets older truths. If you found comfort in this strange tale, if it carried you gently toward rest despite its Gothic mysteries, I would be grateful if you would subscribe to this channel, leave a like, and share with others who seek stories to accompany them into peaceful slumber. Your support allows these tales to continue, allows more mysteries to be whispered into being, allows the tradition of storytelling to endure as surely as Count Orlok endures in his crypt beneath London. And now, as the witching hour passes and dawn approaches wherever you are, as your breathing deepens and your thoughts slow, and the day's concerns fade like morning fog beneath sun, know that you are safe, you are warm, you are held gently by the story that has carried you this far. The mysteries of Sherlock Holmes and the Nosferatu conspiracy have reached their resolution. Professor Blackwood is safe. The Covenant is restored. Balance returns to London and to the world beyond. Sleep now, peaceful and deep. Dream of fog-wrapped streets, if you will, of candle-lit crypts and ancient promises, of worlds layered one upon another like pages in an illuminated manuscript. And wake tomorrow to sunshine and certainty, carrying with you only the pleasant memory of a tale well told, a mystery honourably solved, and the knowledge that somewhere beneath our ordinary world, extraordinary things endure in patient darkness, bound by covenants that protect us all. Good night, dear friend. Good night, wherever you are. May your rest be peaceful, your dreams be gentle, and may you wake refreshed to face whatever wonders tomorrow brings. Until we meet again in another story, in another mystery, in another quiet corner of the night, where tales unfold like mist and carry willing listeners toward the peaceful unknown of sleep. Good night,